It was supposed to be just a normal weekend camping trip, a chance to escape from the hustle of daily life, get away from my phone, and just be in nature. I had always loved the outdoors, the smell of pine trees, the sound of the wind rustling through leaves, and the crisp, cool air in the morning. I've done plenty of camping trips before, so I didn't expect anything strange. But something felt off this time, though I couldn't put my finger on it. The first sign that something was wrong came when we arrived at the campsite. The sun was still high in the sky, but the area had an eerie, unnatural stillness. It wasn't exactly the kind of silence you get when everything is peaceful. It was more like a dead quiet that hung in the air. It made me uncomfortable, but I figured it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. We set up our tents near a small creek, just far enough from the trail so that we wouldn't be disturbed. There were only a few other campers in the area, scattered around the perimeter, but they were all keeping to themselves, and the sound of water flowing over rocks was soothing. I kept telling myself it was going to be a great trip. We had our gear ready, a few days of food packed, and I was looking forward to a peaceful night under the stars. As the evening approached, I built a fire and we sat around it talking about random stuff. How much we missed our regular lives, what we thought about the world, and how the stars were always a little brighter out here. It was all very typical for a camping trip, but that feeling I had earlier, that something wasn't quite right, kept nagging at me. The stillness in the air hadn't let up. The wind didn't pick up. The usual sounds of insects and distant animal calls were strangely absent. We ate dinner, roasted marshmallows, and drank a little. Eventually, we all decided to turn in early, since the next day was going to be a long hike. My friends, who were with me, settled into their tents, and I laid down in mine, trying to shake off that uneasy feeling. It didn't work. I tossed and turned for what felt like hours. Couldn't sleep. The only sounds I could hear were the quiet crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle in the brush. But it wasn't the usual sounds of animals or wind. It was different, like someone was moving around the camp, just out of sight. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't ignore the odd sensation that someone, or something, was out there. Around midnight, I finally gave up on sleep. I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the cool night air. The fire was still burning low, casting long shadows across the campsite. I decided to walk down to the creek to clear my head. The sound of the water was calming, but it couldn't shake the odd feeling that something wasn't right. I stood at the water's edge, staring into the darkness, trying to find something, anything, that would make me feel more grounded. And then I heard it. A soft, deliberate footstep behind me. I froze. My heart started pounding in my chest. I didn't turn around, though. I knew if I did, I would see something I couldn't unsee. The steps were slow, almost like someone was walking carefully, trying not to make a sound. But the fact that they were so deliberate sent a chill down my spine. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my skin prickle with the unmistakable feeling of being watched. I didn't dare move. I waited, and then, after what seemed like forever, the sound of footsteps stopped. But the air felt heavier now, more oppressive. I thought I heard a faint rustle of leaves, like something or someone was shifting in the shadows. I held my breath, praying that whatever it was would go away. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear. Felt like time had stretched into an eternity. But then, just as I was about to turn and sprint back to my tent, I heard something else, a faint voice, low and almost inaudible, as if someone was trying to whisper, but not quite succeeding. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was something that made my stomach churn. Something wrong, something unnatural. I didn't wait to hear more. I spun around and ran back to camp, my feet pounding on the ground, heart racing. I burst into my tent, zipped it up, and buried my head under the blanket, hoping to shut out the terror that was slowly creeping up my spine. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I told my friends what had happened, but they just laughed it off. They said I was probably just spooked by the darkness, that it was all in my head. They didn't seem to understand how real it had felt, but I couldn't shake that feeling that someone, or something, had been out there, watching me. We spent the day hiking, trying to put the strange night behind us. The forest was beautiful, the trees thick with moss and sunlight filtering through the canopy. It was the kind of place you would expect to feel safe, a place that should have made me forget the fear I felt last night. But it didn't. That nagging feeling followed me all day. Every time I heard a twig snap, I felt my pulse race. As the sun began to set again, I made a decision. I was going to stay awake tonight. I wasn't going to let whatever had been following me out there get any closer. We set up a larger fire, hoping the light would keep whatever it was away. But even as the fire blazed, I could feel my heart pounding harder and harder in my chest. Every crackle of the fire sounded like a threat. Every shift in the wind made me jump. It wasn't until late in the evening that I saw it again. This time, there was no mistaking it. A shadow, tall and human-shaped, was standing at the edge of the camp, just outside the reach of the firelight. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just there. I froze, my blood turning to ice. For a long moment, I thought I might be imagining it, but then the figure took a single step forward. Slowly, deliberately, I screamed, waking everyone up. We all scrambled out of our tents, and the figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared. We checked the area, but found nothing.
No footprints.
No signs that anyone had been there at all. That was it. I knew I couldn't stay there another minute. We packed up quickly, all of us nervous and shaken, and left the campsite in the middle of the night. We didn't look back, not once. It wasn't until we were miles away, safely back at the car, that we finally started to breathe again. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching, still following us, even though we were leaving the woods behind. Looking back now, I don't know what it was. Was it a person? Some sort of predator? Or was it just the wild, playing tricks on me? I may never know, but I've never gone camping again. And every time I hear a twig snap behind me, I still remember that night, the feeling of being watched, the feeling of being hunted. I don't know what was out there, but I do know one thing: I never want to find out again. I don't know what drew me to the cabin. Maybe it was the isolation, the promise of quiet, or maybe it was just the idea of getting away from everything for a while. My life had been a blur of work and responsibilities. Deadlines, bills, constant demands, and I had this overwhelming need to disconnect, to clear my head. So, when I saw the listing for the cabin deep in the woods, something inside me said, "This is it." The drive there was long and winding. The further I went, the more the trees seemed to close in, as if they were trying to keep me from leaving. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for one car, with potholes that made it feel like I was driving through a constant shaking. The air outside was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, a smell I'd forgotten how much I liked. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin itself was a bit older than I expected. It wasn't the charming, rustic cabin you see in vacation brochures. It was rough around the edges, with chipped paint and creaky steps leading up to a small porch. But it had a certain kind of character to it. Despite its age, it felt like a place that had stood the test of time, weathered by seasons and storms. I unloaded my things and entered the cabin. The interior was simple, functional. A small living room with an old couch, a kitchen with the basics, and a wood-burning stove. There were no signs of recent use, just layers of dust that seemed to be a part of the cabin's history. The floors creaked as I moved around, and there was a faint smell of mildew that came from somewhere deep in the walls. But there was something comforting about it, too. Felt like a place that was waiting to be lived in again. I started a fire in the stove and made myself a quick dinner. As the night grew colder, I sank into the couch, watching the flames flicker and dance. It was quiet, so quiet that I could hear every creak of the cabin settling, every gust of wind that rattled the windows. The silence was almost deafening, but in a way, it was exactly what I needed. No phone calls, no emails, just the crackling of the fire and the soft whisper of the wind outside. But then there was a sound, a soft knock at the door. I froze, my heart racing for a moment, not knowing if I had imagined it. The knock came again, this time louder. I stood up, slowly walking toward the door. My mind was racing. Who could possibly be out here in the middle of nowhere? The nearest town was miles away, and I hadn't seen another car for hours. I opened the door cautiously, but no one was there. Nothing but the cold, empty night. I stepped outside, looking around, but the clearing was empty. There were no signs of anyone. The knock had sounded real, though. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone, or something, was watching me from the trees. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Maybe an animal had knocked something over, or the wind had made the noise. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to ignore the unease that had settled in my chest. I told myself I was overreacting, but as the night wore on, the feeling didn't go away. I could still hear the occasional creak of the cabin, but there was something different about it now. It wasn't just the house settling. It felt like something was moving around inside. I sat up on the couch, my senses on high alert, straining to listen. But there was nothing. The sound had stopped, and the cabin was once again silent. I tried to brush it off. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing. But then, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard it again. A soft knock. This time, it came from the back of the cabin. I walked over to the window and peered out into the darkness. The trees were still, the ground covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves. There was no movement, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. But then I saw it. A figure. It was standing just beyond the edge of the trees, barely visible in the shadows. At first, I thought it was my eyes playing tricks on me, but as I focused, I saw it clearly. A person just standing there watching the cabin. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Should I confront them? But what if they were dangerous? What if they were just as confused about me being here as I was about them? I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I thought about grabbing my phone and calling for help, but I realized with a sinking feeling that there was no signal out here. The cabin was so far off the grid that I couldn't even get a text through. I sat there for what felt like hours, too scared to move, too scared to make a sound. I could hear my own breathing, my pulse pounding in my ears, and the occasional rustle of the wind outside. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, just waiting. When morning finally came, the figure was gone. I stepped outside cautiously, looking around the clearing. The ground was untouched, no signs of footprints or any disturbance. It was like nothing had happened at all. I couldn't explain it. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just some trick of the light, or maybe there was some reasonable explanation. But that night, it happened again. Another knock, another figure standing in the trees. Only this time, I wasn't alone in the cabin. I had invited a friend, someone I trusted, to join me, hoping the company would ease my mind. But now, even though there were two of us, the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just someone else renting a cabin nearby, or maybe it was some local who lived in the woods. But deep down, we both knew that wasn't the case. The figure was too deliberate, too calculated. Felt like we were being stalked. The third night was the worst. We were sitting by the fire, trying to act normal, when the knock came again. This time, it was much louder, almost as if it was coming from inside the cabin. My friend and I exchanged nervous glances. We both stood up, both of us instinctively reaching for something, anything, nearby to defend ourselves. We heard a sound, soft at first, then louder, something scraping against the outside of the cabin, like nails on wood. It was enough to send a shiver down my spine. Then the door to the cabin was yanked open. I don't know what we expected, but it wasn't this. Standing there was a man, dirty, disheveled, and wild-eyed. He was breathing heavily, his face twisted in a strange mix of fear and anger. Without thinking, I slammed the door shut and bolted it. I backed away, heart racing. My friend was already on the phone, trying to get a signal, but the call wouldn't go through. The man was still out there, pacing around the cabin like a trapped animal, his eyes occasionally glancing in through the windows. For hours, we stayed inside, praying that he would go away. But he didn't. We could hear him outside, muttering to himself, scratching at the walls, pacing back and forth. It was clear he wasn't going to leave until he had what he wanted. We were trapped. The only option left was to leave the cabin. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but it was clear we weren't going to make it through the night without a confrontation. We made a run for it at dawn. As we reached the car, I glanced back at the cabin. The man was still there, standing in the doorway just watching us. We left and we didn't look back. When we finally got to the nearest town, we told the authorities what happened. They assured us they'd investigate, but something about the way they reacted made me feel like they didn't believe us. Maybe it was just the remote nature of the cabin. Maybe it was just the way the town operated. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something much worse. Something that had been waiting for us in those woods. Something that had known we were coming long before we ever set foot in that cabin. We never went back. And to this day, I don't know who or what that man was. But I know one thing for sure. There are things in those woods, things that don't belong in this world. And some places are better left undisturbed. I never really understood the draw of camping. My friends had always raved about it. The fresh air, the escape from the hustle and bustle of city life, the chance to reconnect with nature. To me, it always seemed like a hassle. The bugs, the cold at night, and the constant worry about whether I'd forget something important were enough to make me stay at home. But this time, something changed. Maybe it was the promise of getting away from everything, or maybe I was just tired of the same old routine. Either way, I found myself agreeing to go on a weekend camping trip with a group of friends. We picked a remote spot, somewhere deep in the forest that none of us had ever been to before. The kind of place where you couldn't hear cars or people, just the wind rustling through the trees and the sounds of the wild. We left on a Friday afternoon, the sun still high in the sky as we packed our gear into the cars. There were 6 of us in total, 2 couples and my friend Mark, who had insisted on going even though he'd never been camping before. I think he thought it would be an adventure, a way to impress the group. But none of us really knew what we were getting ourselves into. The drive out there was long, the roads winding and narrow as we got further from civilization. The landscape began to change as we passed through small towns, fields, and then thick stretches of woods. The deeper we went, the more isolated it felt. There was something eerie about it. The quiet, the way the trees seemed to close in on the road, blocking out the sun in places. Finally, we reached the trailhead. We parked the cars, grabbed our bags, and began the hike into the woods. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the kind of smell that makes you feel like you're in a completely different world. It was peaceful at first, just the sounds of our footsteps crunching on the trail and the occasional bird call in the distance. But as we got further into the woods, something started to feel off. The forest was dense, almost oppressive. The trees seemed to stretch on forever, their branches twisting and reaching out like long fingers. It was like we were walking into something much bigger than ourselves, something ancient. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. We reached our campsite just before sunset, a small clearing near a stream with a fire pit already set up. It was the perfect spot, or at least it seemed that way at the time. We set up the tents, gathered some firewood, and got the fire going as the last light of day faded behind the trees. As the night wore on, we sat around the fire, telling stories and roasting marshmallows. The warmth from the flames felt good, and the sound of the crackling wood was comforting. But there was a heaviness to the silence that crept in as the night deepened. The forest around us seemed too still, like it was holding its breath. Mark was the first to mention it. He laughed nervously, looking around. "You guys hear that?" At first, I didn't hear anything, just the wind rustling through the leaves. But then, I heard it too, a faint sound, almost like a low hum. It wasn't constant, but it was there, somewhere in the distance. It wasn't an animal or the wind. It was too rhythmic, almost like something human. "Probably just the wind," I said, trying to shake off the unease. But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The hum was unsettling, like something was out there in the darkness, just beyond the edge of the firelight. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound being the occasional snap of the firewood. But the hum wouldn't go away. It was still there, faint but persistent. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the trees, but no matter how hard we tried, none of us could pinpoint its source. It wasn't an animal, not anything I'd ever heard before. After what felt like hours, the hum finally faded away. But by then, the mood had changed. We all felt it, that nagging feeling in the back of our minds, the one that tells you something isn't right. It wasn't like we were scared of some ghost or creature lurking in the dark. It was just the feeling that something wasn't as it should be. We all agreed to head to bed early, though none of us really felt like sleeping. I crawled into my tent, trying to push the unease out of my mind, but the sound from earlier still lingered, echoing in my head. The night seemed too quiet after that. The hum was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I must have finally fallen asleep at some point, because I woke up to the sound of something moving outside my tent. Soft at first, just the rustling of leaves, then louder, like footsteps. My heart raced. I lay still, straining to listen. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something passing by. But there was something about the way it moved, too deliberate, too close to the tent. I held my breath, waiting for the sound to pass. But it didn't. The footsteps came closer, stopping just outside my tent. I could feel the presence there, just on the other side of the thin fabric. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was it one of my friends messing with me? No, it couldn't be. They were all still asleep in their tents, I was sure of it. The air outside was thick and still, like the entire forest was holding its breath with me. My hands were clammy as I slowly reached for the zipper of my tent, trying to move as quietly as possible. My mind screamed at me to stay still, not to open it, but the need to know what was outside was overpowering. I took a deep breath, unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. The campfire was just a faint glow in the distance, casting long shadows across the clearing. I didn't see anything at first. No movement, no shapes lurking in the dark, just the stillness of the night. I was about to zip the tent back up when I saw something. A shadow, just beyond the reach of the firelight, moving between the trees. It was fast, too fast to be a person, too deliberate to be an animal. My blood ran cold. The footsteps had stopped, but the presence was still there, watching. I didn't sleep at all that night. I spent the rest of the hours lying wide awake, my eyes fixed on the entrance of the tent, half expecting something, or someone, to come inside. When morning finally came, I was the first to crawl out of my tent. The others were still asleep, none of them showing any signs of being disturbed by whatever had happened during the night. I didn't say anything, didn't want to sound paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I packed up my things early and told the group I was heading back to the trailhead. It wasn't that I was scared. Exactly. It was more that I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something unseen moving just beyond my vision. The hum from the night before still echoed in my mind, a constant reminder that we hadn't been alone in those woods. The others, of course, thought I was overreacting. They decided to stay another night, but I couldn't. I grabbed my gear, said my goodbyes, and left. I don't know what it was that we heard that night. Could have been a person out there in the woods, though I don't know why they would be so close to our campsite. Maybe it was some kind of animal, something I just didn't recognize, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the hum or the footsteps. It was the silence that followed them. The forest had felt alive, watching, waiting. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't ignore it. As I walked back to the trailhead, the air around me felt lighter, less oppressive. I couldn't explain it, but it was like the weight that had hung over me for the past 24 hours had finally lifted. When I reached my car, I looked back at the woods one last time. The trees were silent now, as if nothing had happened at all. But I knew better. Something had been out there, something that didn't belong in the stillness of the forest. I never went camping again, and whenever I hear a hum in the distance, I can't help but wonder if it's the forest, calling out, waiting for someone else to listen. It started out as a quiet weekend getaway. I had been feeling worn out, and a few days in a cabin, away from the noise of the city, seemed like the perfect way to recharge. A friend of mine had a small cabin tucked deep in the woods about a 3-hour drive away. It wasn't exactly luxury. It had no Wi-Fi, no TV, just the basics. A wood stove, a couple of bedrooms, and a porch overlooking a dense forest. But that's exactly what I needed. Peace, isolation, and some time alone to think. I arrived late on a Friday afternoon. The drive had been long, and the winding road leading up to the cabin was barely more than a dirt path. The woods were thick with trees, and the sun was already sinking behind the mountains. As I parked in front of the cabin, I couldn't help but notice how quiet everything was. The only sound was the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze and the occasional distant call of a bird. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like something is just waiting to break it. I grabbed my bags and walked up the creaky porch steps, unlocking the door with the key my friend had given me. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood and something faintly earthy, like pine needles. There was a small kitchen to the left, a living room with a couple of worn couches, and a fireplace on the far wall. The light was dim, but there was something warm about it. I liked the way it felt, isolated but comfortable. The place was as simple as I remembered. I threw my bags onto the couch, unpacked a bit, and made myself a cup of tea. I sat by the window, sipping slowly, watching the trees sway in the twilight. There was something about the woods here that felt different, more alive in a way. I had spent time in the wilderness before, but this place was different. Maybe it was the stillness or the feeling of being so far from anything. It was beautiful in a haunting sort of way. As the sky darkened, I built a fire in the fireplace and settled in. I had no intention of doing much, just relaxing, maybe reading, and enjoying the solitude. But as the hours passed and the wind picked up, I started to notice something. The cabin, despite its solitude, didn't feel empty. There was a sense of presence, like someone or something was just outside my line of sight. The kind of sensation you get when you feel eyes on you, even when no one is there. I tried to ignore it. It was just my imagination, I told myself. The crackling fire and the wind outside were enough to fill the silence. But then it happened. A noise, a soft tapping, almost like a finger drumming on wood. But it wasn't coming from inside. Came from the direction of the door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't remember hearing anyone approach. I hadn't seen a single car on the road leading up to the cabin. I set my tea down, stood up, and cautiously walked over to the door. There was nothing, just the dark outline of the porch and the trees beyond. The wind was picking up now, howling through the branches, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been standing there, just out of view. I double-checked the lock and returned to the fire. My hands were shaking, but I tried to push the unsettling feeling aside. I was alone. There was nothing out there, just the wind. I settled back onto the couch, trying to convince myself to relax. But the longer I sat there, the more the silence felt suffocating. Every crack of the wood, every shift in the breeze felt magnified. My mind kept drifting back to the tapping sound. Had I imagined it, or had someone really been there? The night stretched on, and I eventually went to bed. I kept the curtains closed tightly, and I slept fitfully, waking up several times, disoriented, with the sense that something was wrong. The wind outside had grown stronger, rattling the windows and making the whole cabin creak. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling exhausted. I hadn't slept well, and the strange noises from the night before were still fresh in my mind. I told myself it was just the wind, that the cabin was old, and it had its quirks, but something still felt off. I went out onto the porch to get some fresh air, hoping to clear my head. The sun was up now, casting long shadows over the forest. Everything looked so peaceful, too peaceful. The forest stretched out in every direction, a dense thicket of trees and underbrush. The silence was back, but this time it felt even more oppressive, as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting. I decided to take a walk. Maybe the exercise would help shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. I grabbed a jacket, put on my boots, and headed down a narrow trail that led into the woods. First, it was nice. The sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled light on the ground. I walked for about an hour, lost in the quiet beauty of the place. But then, as I was rounding a bend in the trail, I noticed something strange, something out of place. A set of footprints, fresh ones. They were larger than mine, deeper in the soft earth, and they led off the trail, disappearing into the underbrush. I stopped dead in my tracks. I was certain I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail when I left the cabin. The prints looked recent, maybe from the last few hours. They didn't seem to belong to any animal I recognized. I followed them instinctively, even though my gut was screaming at me to turn back. The trail grew more overgrown as I moved deeper into the woods, and the prints became harder to follow, but I kept going. My breath came in shallow bursts, and my pulse thudded in my ears. Every step felt heavier than the last. The trail eventually led me to a small clearing, and that's when I saw it. A broken-down shack, barely visible through the thick brush. It was made of old wood, its windows shattered, and its roof sagging under the weight of age. I felt my stomach drop. I didn't know why, but the sight of it unsettled me more than anything else I had encountered. There was no reason for a shack to be so far out here, in the middle of nowhere. I stepped closer, carefully, trying not to make any noise. My mind raced with questions. Who built this place? Who would live out here so far from the cabin, in the heart of the woods? I reached the door of the shack and hesitated. Something told me to turn back, but I couldn't. I had to know. I pushed the door open with a creak and stepped inside. The interior was dark, with the faint smell of mold and decay. The floor was covered in dust, and the walls were bare except for a few faded pictures and some old shelves. But what caught my eye were the marks on the floor, scattered, faint, almost like scratches. Took me a moment to realize what I was looking at. They were recent, too recent. Suddenly, The air felt thick, suffocating. My pulse raced, and I quickly turned to leave. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, like someone was breathing behind me. I spun around, heart in my throat, but there was nothing there. I didn't wait to investigate further. I bolted out of the shack, my breath ragged, and didn't stop running until I reached the cabin. By the time I got back, it was late afternoon. My mind was a blur, spinning with confusion and dread. Had I imagined the whole thing? The shack, the footprints, the whisper? It all felt like a dream or a nightmare. I locked the door and closed all the windows, not daring to go outside again. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to calm myself down. The shadows outside seemed to press against the cabin walls, and the silence was oppressive. It felt like the woods themselves were watching, waiting for something. As the night deepened, I heard it again, the tapping, faint but distinct. It was coming from the direction of the door. I grabbed the fireplace poker and stood by the door, my breath shallow, waiting. The noise grew louder, more persistent. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. And then I realized the footprints, the shack, the strange sounds, they weren't random. They were all connected. Something or someone had been out there and they were watching me. But I wasn't alone anymore. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like there was something protecting me. Something that had been with me all along. The presence that had been lingering in the cabin wasn't a threat. It was a warning. The tapping started again, but this time it was different. It wasn't outside anymore. It was inside. I turned toward the sound, and for the first time I understood. The cabin wasn't empty, and it wasn't mine to keep. I've never been the type to be afraid of the dark, but something about the woods that night felt different. It was like the trees had a life of their own, creaking and shifting in a way that was too intentional. It was a feeling I couldn't shake. The woods were quiet, unnaturally quiet, and the silence felt as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I arrived at the cabin just as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the overgrown path that led to it. I had rented the place for the weekend, just a little break from the chaos of the city. I had no intention of doing anything other than unwind. It was supposed to be peaceful. The cabin was secluded, tucked away deep in a forest far from the nearest town. The road was bumpy and barely passable, but I didn't mind. There was something calming about being away from everything, surrounded by nothing but trees. The cabin itself wasn't much to look at, just a small, weathered building with wooden walls and a slanted roof. The paint had long since peeled away, and the place looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. Still, the owner assured me it would be fine. I parked the car and grabbed my bags, feeling the weight of the silence around me as I walked up to the front door. The air was still, the smell of damp earth and pine filling my nostrils. I hesitated for a moment, standing on the creaky porch before unlocking the door and stepping inside. The inside was exactly what I expected. It was simple, almost bare. The floors were creaky, and the furniture was old but serviceable. A couch sat in front of a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area to the side. It looked like a place where someone could come to get away from the world for a little while. I'd brought some food with me, just enough for the weekend, and there was a small wood stove in the corner for warmth. I unpacked my things and made myself comfortable, starting a small fire in the fireplace. The warmth spread through the room quickly, and I sank into the couch, staring into the flames. I hadn't planned on doing much, just a bit of reading, maybe some writing. The peace and quiet were exactly what I needed. But as the night settled in, something changed. It was subtle at first, a feeling that crept over me, like I wasn't alone. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt eyes on me, as though the walls themselves were watching. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a chill despite the fire crackling in the hearth. I told myself it was nothing. The woods can play tricks on your mind, especially at night. Maybe I was just imagining things. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one there. I decided to go to bed early, hoping sleep would bring some relief from the unease that had settled in my chest. I turned off the lights and crawled into the bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin. The room was dark, but I could hear the wind howling outside, the occasional rustle of branches against the cabin's wooden walls. Sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, the sensation of being watched never leaving me. It was like something was lurking just beyond the edge of my consciousness, waiting for me to fall asleep so it could make its move. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke with a start. The air felt heavier now, as though the room had become suffocating. I lay still, listening. There was no sound, no wind, no rustling of branches. Just silence. Deep, unnerving silence. I glanced at the clock on the bedside table. It was well past midnight. That's when I heard it, the faintest sound, coming from somewhere outside the cabin. A soft scraping like nails dragging across wood. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. The sound stopped, and for a moment, there was only the sound of my own breathing. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just an animal or the wind playing tricks again. But then it came again, louder this time, scraping, and then a soft thud, like something heavy being dropped onto the porch. My blood ran cold. I forced myself to move, to sit up, but my body felt like it was made of lead. I didn't want to get up, didn't want to go check what was out there, but I knew I couldn't stay in that bed, not with the sounds getting closer. Slowly, I slid out from under the covers, my feet touching the cold wooden floor. My heart was pounding in my ears as I crept toward the window, peering through the dusty curtains. The moonlight bathed the forest in an eerie glow, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. There was nothing out there, just trees. The stillness was overwhelming. But then I saw something, a figure barely visible in the shadows near the edge of the trees. It was tall, unnaturally tall, standing perfectly still. I couldn't make out any features, but the silhouette was unmistakable. My stomach churned. I didn't know who or what it was, but it wasn't an animal. I stepped back from the window, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't know what to do. The sounds had stopped, but that figure, whatever it was still there, standing motionless in the dark. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I wanted to call someone, but there was no signal out here. The nearest town was miles away. I was alone, completely alone. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy iron skillet, and held it in my hands like a weapon. The silence stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. Then the door creaked open. I didn't hear anyone turn the handle, didn't hear the footsteps on the porch. The door just opened, slowly, as if something had been waiting for it to move. My heart nearly stopped. I could see the dark shape in the doorway, its outline barely visible in the dim light. I didn't know who or what it was, but in that moment, I realized something. The figure in the woods wasn't the only thing that had been watching me. The door was open now, and I had no choice but to face whatever was standing on the other side. It started as just another road trip, a way to clear my head and get some time away from the noise. I had always liked the open road, especially the parts where the highway stretched for miles with nothing but plains on either side. There was something peaceful about it. No traffic, no people. Just you, your car, and the hum of tires on asphalt. That's all I needed. I was heading north through a part of the country I hadn't been before, taking the back roads because I hated interstates. The kind of roads where you might not see another car for hours, where gas stations are rare, and the only signs of life are the occasional farmhouse or a rusting truck parked on the side of a gravel road. The weather was decent enough, cold but clear, and I figured I'd make it to the next town before dark. My tank was just under half full. I wasn't worried. I had driven through worse places with less gas and still made it. The road rolled out in front of me, empty and endless, like a strip of gray cutting through the dried-out fields. About an hour in, I noticed how quiet everything felt. Not just the road, but the land itself.
No birds.
No wind, just an eerie stillness that settled into my chest. I brushed it off as nothing more than the isolation. I hadn't seen another car in at least 30 minutes. Then the trouble started. I glanced down at my dashboard and noticed the temperature gauge climbing.
Fast.
Too fast. At first, I thought it had to be a glitch. My car wasn't that old, and I'd kept it in good shape. But when the engine started to sputter, my stomach sank. Shit, I muttered. I pulled over to the side of the road, gravel crunching under my tires. Steam started hissing from under the hood. I turned off the engine and sat there for a second, staring out at the empty landscape. Nothing but dead grass and power lines stretching into the horizon. I popped the hood and got out. The cold hit me hard, biting at my face and hands. The engine was hot to the touch, and steam was rising from the radiator. I didn't know much about cars, but I knew enough to realize this wasn't something I could fix on my own. I stood there for a minute, listening to the soft ticking of the cooling engine. No cars in sight, no houses, no signs of life at all. Just me and the road. I pulled out my phone. No signal, of course. I tried walking around, holding the phone up like an idiot, hoping for even one bar. Nothing. I leaned against the car, staring down the road in both directions. Felt like standing on the edge of the world, where everything just stopped. The sun was starting to dip toward the horizon, and I knew I didn't have much daylight left. I had two choices: stay with the car and hope someone came along, or start walking. I checked the map on my phone. According to the GPS, which barely loaded, I was at least 15 miles from the nearest town. No way I'd make it before dark. Still, sitting around didn't feel like an option. I grabbed my backpack from the trunk, stuffed a bottle of water and a flashlight inside, and started walking. The road stretched on forever, straight and flat, with nothing but fields on either side. The sky was turning that pale shade of gray-blue that comes just before dusk, and the temperature was dropping fast. My breath puffed out in little clouds, and my footsteps echoed in the silence. I kept glancing back at my car, watching it grow smaller and smaller until it was just a dot on the horizon. I walked for what felt like hours. The cold seeped into my bones, and my legs started to ache. I kept telling myself that someone would come by. Any minute now, a car would appear in the distance, and I'd wave it down, and everything would be fine. But no one came. Eventually, the sun slipped below the horizon, and darkness settled over the land. The stars came out, bright and cold, but they didn't offer much light. I switched on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark. It made me feel a little better, but not much. The road looked different at night, more isolated, more hostile. Every shadow seemed to stretch and shift, and the silence was almost oppressive. I kept walking, trying not to think about how alone I was. Then I heard it, a sound in the distance. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of the wind, maybe. But then I heard it again, a faint rustling, like something moving through the grass. I stopped and listened, my heart pounding. Nothing. I shook my head, laughing nervously. Just the wind. I kept walking, but the sound came again, closer this time. I swung my flashlight toward the field, the beam cutting through the darkness. The grass swayed gently in the breeze, but there was nothing else. Just an empty field stretching out into the night. I told myself I was being stupid. My mind was playing tricks on me, that's all. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I picked up the pace, my footsteps crunching on the gravel. The rustling seemed to follow me, staying just out of sight. Every time I turned around, the sound stopped. By the time I saw the faint outline of a building in the distance, I was practically running. It was an old gas station, the kind you'd see in movies about road trips gone wrong. The windows were dark, and the sign was faded and peeling, but it was something, a place to get out of the cold. I pushed open the door, and it creaked loudly in the silence. Inside, the air was stale, and the floor was covered in dust. Shelves stood half empty, stocked with ancient cans of soup and boxes of cereal that had probably expired years ago. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. No answer. I found a dusty old chair and sat down, trying to catch my breath. My legs were killing me, and my fingers were numb from the cold. I needed to rest for a minute, just long enough to warm up. Then I'd figure out what to do next. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to the sound of footsteps. My eyes snapped open, and my heart jumped into my throat. Someone was outside. I sat perfectly still, listening. The footsteps crunched on the gravel outside, slow and deliberate. Whoever it was, they were walking around the building, circling it. I turned off my flashlight and crouched behind the counter, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the door creaked open. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed. I couldn't see who it was, but I could hear them moving around. Their footsteps were slow, deliberate, like they were looking for something, or someone. I stayed hidden, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps faded, and the door creaked shut. I waited a few more minutes before daring to move. I peeked over the counter, my eyes scanning the darkened store. Empty. I grabbed my backpack and crept toward the door, my heart in my throat. I pushed it open slowly, the hinges squealing in protest. The night was still and silent. No sign of whoever had been there. I didn't stick around to find out if they were coming back. I ran down the road, my flashlight bouncing wildly in the dark. I didn't stop until I was sure I was far enough away. Eventually, I saw headlights in the distance. A truck was coming toward me, its engine rumbling in the quiet night. I waved my arms, nearly collapsing in relief when it pulled over. The driver rolled down the window, a middle-aged guy with a tired face. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, trying to catch my breath. "Car broke down. Been walking for hours." He motioned for me to get in. "Come on, I'll take you to town." As I climbed into the truck, I glanced back down the road. The gas station was barely visible in the distance, just a dark shape against the night sky. I never found out who or what had been there with me, and I didn't want to. I woke up to a thick fog hanging low over the ground, a fog that seemed to swallow up everything in its path. The trees around me were nothing but silhouettes, their outlines barely visible through the mist. I had no idea how I'd gotten here, no memory of the hike, the path, or even when I last checked my phone for the time. It was just me and the fog, the cold and damp air, and a growing sense of dread. I took a deep breath, hoping the fog might lift soon, but the chill in the air seemed to only make it worse. My shoes squelched against the muddy earth as I tried to stand up, my legs stiff from whatever sleep or unconsciousness had held me. The ground was wet beneath me, and I looked around, trying to piece together what was happening. How had I ended up here? The last thing I remembered was the trailhead at the edge of the forest. I'd come out here to get some fresh air, away from the city and all its noise. I'd planned on following a well-marked path, the kind that would loop back to where I started after a few hours. I'd read about the trail online. Perfect for beginners, they'd said. Simple, beautiful views, they'd promised. I had no reason to believe anything could go wrong. But now, I had no idea which way to go. I glanced around the forest, the trees just barely visible through the thick mist. There was a faint path leading off into the woods in front of me, but the ground was so slick that my first few steps nearly made me slip. I wiped the mud off my pants and steadied myself before walking slowly forward. The mist was oppressive. Every few steps I'd expect the fog to clear, but instead, it felt like it just grew thicker, pressing down on me. My breath came out in short bursts, forming little clouds of white vapor in the air. The air was too cold for comfort, but my jacket wasn't much protection. I hadn't dressed for a trip this long. I checked my watch. The time seemed off, like it wasn't moving, or maybe it was just the panic setting in. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't packed enough food for an extended journey. I'd planned to be back by noon, but now the sun had shifted. How long had I been out here? I had no idea. I tried to calm myself down. There were always people on these trails, right? There had to be. I kept telling myself that I was fine, that I could just walk back and everything would be okay. But the longer I walked, the more I doubted that idea. I'd expected the trail to be straight and easy to follow. But as I looked around, the trees looked all the same, tall, dark, and unchanging. Every direction seemed identical. Nothing looked familiar. I pulled out my phone, trying to check for a signal, but it was dead. I cursed under my breath and shoved it back into my pocket. I walked for what felt like hours, but time had become irrelevant. My legs burned, my feet were sore, and my head was starting to ache. Every time I looked around, the fog seemed to be swallowing the trees whole, turning everything into one gray blur. The path, if there even was one anymore, was hard to see. It could have easily been an animal trail or nothing at all. I stopped for a moment, my heart pounding, a lump in my throat. I needed to find something, anything, a marker, a sign, anything that could tell me where I was. There had to be something. I wasn't completely lost. I refused to believe it. In the distance, I thought I saw something, a dark figure. Maybe it was a person, or another tree. My mind played tricks on me. I took a step closer, squinting through the mist. It was nothing, just another patch of trees, their gnarled branches twisting toward the sky. Nothing more. I shook my head, trying to clear it. I couldn't afford to waste time. The cold was biting, and the fog didn't seem to be lifting. I was getting dizzy now. The hunger, the tiredness, the overwhelming sense of confusion. It was all adding up. Another hour passed, maybe more. I could no longer tell. The daylight was dimming, the thick fog making it impossible to gauge how much time had passed. The trees around me seemed to close in, and I could feel the weight of the woods pressing against me. My legs were giving out, my muscles weak and trembling. I found myself leaning against a tree for support, my breath coming fast and shallow. There was no clear path ahead, no sign of civilization. I thought of my family, of my friends, of how this could turn into a nightmare if I didn't find a way out. They wouldn't even know where to start looking for me. Then, just as panic began to rise in my chest, I saw it. A small clearing ahead. There were fewer trees, and I could see a little light breaking through the fog. For the first time in hours, I felt a glimmer of hope. I pushed forward, each step feeling heavier than the last, but I couldn't stop now. I had to get out. I needed to get out. I stumbled into the clearing and stopped dead in my tracks. There, in the middle of the open space, was a small wooden structure. Cabin of sorts. It wasn't much, just a small shack, its wood weathered and covered in patches of moss. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could see the faintest light. I didn't know what possessed me to approach it. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe the desperate need to find some kind of answer. I walked slowly toward the door, my heart racing. When I pushed it open, the creak of the old wood echoed in the silence. Inside was bare, no furniture, no signs of life. It was empty except for a few old crates stacked against one wall. It wasn't a home, not in the traditional sense, but it was shelter. And at that moment, shelter was all I cared about. I sat down against the wall, my legs too tired to support me any longer. My body felt like it was shutting down, but I couldn't stop my mind from racing. How had I ended up here? How could I have wandered so far off the trail? I tried to gather my thoughts, but the fog in my head wouldn't clear. My stomach growled again, but there was nothing to eat. I couldn't stay here. I knew that. The cold would soon become unbearable, and who knew how long this fog would last. Suddenly, I heard a noise outside, a soft crackle of footsteps. My heart skipped. Was someone else out there? I hadn't seen anyone since the trail. I stood up slowly, trying to remain as quiet as possible, listening carefully. The footsteps got closer, but there was no voice, no sounds of conversation. I moved toward the door, peering out carefully. A figure appeared through the fog. A man, wearing a dark coat, his features hard to distinguish in the mist. He was walking with purpose, but didn't seem to notice me. I watched him for a moment, debating whether to call out or stay hidden. But then, something unexpected happened. The man stopped and turned, as if sensing my presence. Our eyes met for a brief second. "Lost?" he asked, his voice rough but calm. I nodded, too exhausted to speak. "Follow me. I know the way out." I didn't hesitate. With relief flooding my chest, I followed him as he led me through the woods, the fog still thick but no longer suffocating. His pace was steady, and despite the exhaustion in my body, I felt the tiniest spark of hope returning. He seemed to know where he was going. Maybe he had been here before. Maybe he was one of those rare people who could navigate these woods with ease. After what felt like an eternity, the fog began to lift, and the trees started to thin. The trail ahead became clearer, and I recognized the familiar path I had been on earlier. The man stopped and turned to me, his face still obscured by the mist. "You're almost there," he said simply. "It's not far." And then, without another word, he walked off, disappearing into the woods, leaving me with nothing but the sound of my own footsteps as I made my way back to safety. I hadn't intended to go to the cabin that weekend. It was meant to be a relaxing getaway, just me and the solitude of the forest. I'd been needing a break for weeks, and after a rough stretch at work, I thought a couple of days in the woods would help me clear my head. The cabin wasn't much, just a small, simple structure nestled deep in the woods about 2 hours from town. It wasn't luxurious by any means, but it was cozy, with a wood stove for warmth and a little stream nearby for peace and quiet. I'd rented it from a friend of a friend, a place they had used for years. "It's perfect," they'd said. "You'll love it." I took their word for it. The drive up wasn't bad, just a winding road through dense trees and hills. The weather had been a bit iffy, but nothing that seemed too concerning. The sky was overcast, and a light drizzle began to fall as I made my way through the last stretch of dirt road leading to the cabin. When I arrived, it was quiet, too quiet. The trees around the cabin were tall, their branches heavy with moisture. A few birds chirped in the distance, but aside from that, it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. I unloaded my car, grabbed the few things I needed, and made my way inside. The wooden door creaked on its hinges as I pushed it open. It smelled of pine and earth inside, like the forest had seeped into the walls. The cabin was just as I expected, simple but functional. A small living room with a couple of mismatched chairs, a stove in the corner, a small kitchen area, and a loft above where the bed was. I'd brought a book and some snacks to last me through the weekend, planning to spend most of my time reading, maybe doing some light hiking if the weather cleared up. The first night was peaceful. The sound of the rain against the roof was oddly comforting. I made a fire in the stove, cooked a quick dinner, and settled in for a quiet evening. But as the night deepened, the air grew thicker. The wind picked up outside, the trees groaning and swaying. It wasn't enough to be alarming, but it felt off. There was something about the isolation that was starting to get to me that I tried not to let it bother me. I told myself I was just being paranoid. After all, it was just a cabin in the woods, nothing unusual. The fire crackled, the shadows danced on the walls, and I sat back in my chair, reading for a while until I fell asleep. It wasn't until the middle of the night that I woke up, feeling something was wrong. At first, I couldn't place it, but then I noticed it. The silence. The wind had stopped. The rain had stopped. The usual nighttime sounds, the rustling of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, even the distant barking of some animal were all gone. It was so quiet, it felt suffocating. I lay there in the dark, straining to hear something, anything, but there was nothing. The stillness was overwhelming. After what felt like hours, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to check the cabin to make sure everything was fine. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and crept downstairs. The beam of light swept across the room, illuminating the worn wooden floorboards. Nothing seemed out of place, but the uneasy feeling hadn't left me. I stepped outside onto the porch, the cool air hitting my face. It was so still, I could hear my own breath. I shone the flashlight across the yard, scanning the area, but there was no sign of movement, nothing but trees. Yet something didn't feel right. I stood there for a few minutes trying to shake off the tension. There was no reason to be scared. I was just being ridiculous. The wind would pick up again, and everything would be fine. But then I heard something, a faint rustling in the trees. It was hard to pinpoint where exactly it was coming from, but it was there, just a slight movement, a soft scrape against the underbrush. My heart skipped a beat. I strained to listen, trying to determine if it was an animal or something else. The rustling stopped. Silence returned. I stood frozen, my breath shallow, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, just the wind or a small animal. But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. Someone or something was out there. I quickly went back inside and locked the door behind me. I grabbed my phone and checked the signal. Nothing. Of course, there wouldn't be any cell service out here, but I had hoped. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just nerves. I could get through the weekend. It was probably just a deer or some other animal. Nothing to worry about. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping. The morning light filtered through the small windows, casting a warm glow across the room. The silence from the night before was gone, replaced by the usual sounds of the forest. I spent most of the day outside, walking around the cabin and the small trails nearby. I had hoped the fresh air would clear my head, but the sense of unease hadn't completely left me. It lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing at me. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the leaves, made me jump. That evening, I made another fire, sat down with a book, and tried to relax. But as the sun set, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the quiet from the night before, it was the whole place. The isolation, the way the trees seemed to close in around the cabin. The shadows outside seemed to grow longer, and every gust of wind felt more like a whisper, like something was watching me. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, footsteps. This time they were closer. I froze, straining to listen. I wasn't imagining it. There were footsteps outside the cabin. Slowly, deliberately, as if someone was walking just out of sight, circling the cabin. My pulse quickened, and I stood up, quietly moving toward the window. I peeked through the curtains, shining the flashlight out into the dark. There was nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the wind. I scanned the area again, feeling my breath catch in my throat. Still nothing. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just ignore it anymore. Someone or something was out there. I went to the front door and locked it. Then I checked the back door, the windows, making sure everything was secure. But that feeling of being watched didn't go away. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch, eyes darting to every sound, every movement outside the cabin. But no one came. The next morning, I decided I had enough. I couldn't stay here another night, not with that constant feeling of being watched, not with the strange noises. I packed up my things, grabbed my keys, and drove away as quickly as I could, barely looking back. As I drove down the dirt road, I couldn't help but glance at the trees, at the cabin in the distance. It looked peaceful from afar, serene even. But I knew the truth. It was the isolation that made it feel unnatural. The sense that something was lurking, just beyond sight, waiting. I told myself I'd never go back, but the feeling never really left. Every time I find myself alone in the woods, I hear the footsteps again, just on the edge of my hearing. It's not a sound I'll ever forget, and that's why I'll never return to that cabin. Not in a million years. The cabin was isolated. I had rented it from an old family friend who lived a few hours away. They spoke about it like it was a gem, nestled in the woods and perfect for unwinding. But when I first arrived, something felt off about it. The cabin was old, the kind of structure that looked as if it had been neglected for years. Its wooden beams groaned in the wind, and there was a layer of dust over everything, even though it wasn't abandoned. I had wanted solitude. My work had become overwhelming, and I thought spending a few days by myself in the wilderness would clear my head. I pulled up to the driveway, the gravel crunching under my tires as I parked. The sun was setting, casting long shadows on the trees that surrounded the cabin. The area was quiet, too quiet. I didn't hear a single bird call. No sounds of wildlife, just the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. I grabbed my bag and stepped out of the car. The air was crisp, but it carried a strange dampness, like something had been sitting stagnant for a long time. I couldn't put my finger on it. It wasn't a bad smell, but it wasn't fresh either. The front door creaked as I opened it, the hinges protesting. Inside, the air smelled like wood and something else, stale, like it hadn't been ventilated in ages. The cabin itself was small but cozy. A stone fireplace sat to the left of the entry, and there was a couch and a few armchairs scattered around a wooden coffee table. The walls were covered in old photographs, black and white images of people I didn't recognize. They were smiling in some, but the smiles felt off, forced in a way that didn't sit right with me. I dropped my bag onto the couch and walked to the window. The view was beautiful, the woods stretching endlessly into the distance. But even then, I could feel that stillness. The world outside was silent, and it felt like the silence was pressing in on me. I tried to shake off the feeling. I came here for peace, and I wasn't going to let my nerves get the best of me. The first night went by uneventfully. I cooked myself a simple meal, watched a bit of TV, and went to bed early. The sounds of the forest outside seemed to get louder as the night wore on. I could hear the wind picking up, the branches scraping against the cabin. It wasn't enough to keep me awake, though. I fell into a deep sleep, the kind where you forget where you are for a while. But the next morning, things started to get strange. When I woke up, I noticed a faint smell. Burnt wood. It wasn't strong, but it lingered in the air, like someone had used the fireplace. The only problem was I hadn't lit a fire. I walked to the living room, my feet making soft thuds on the wooden floor. Nothing seemed out of place. The logs in the fireplace were cold, the ashes untouched. I chalked it up to my imagination and decided to go for a walk outside. The woods were dense. As I wandered, I kept expecting to see some kind of wildlife, a deer, maybe a rabbit, but there was nothing, just trees and the quiet hum of the wind. My footsteps crunched on the fallen leaves, the only sound that broke the stillness. After a while, I found myself near a small stream. It wasn't much, just a trickle of water weaving through the rocks, but the air around it felt different, thicker. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned to head back to the cabin, but as I walked, something caught my eye. A piece of cloth, caught on a branch, fluttering gently in the wind. It was an old, tattered rag. I took a step closer, instinctively reaching out to pull it off the branch. The moment my fingers touched it, I heard a snap behind me. I froze, my heart racing. But when I turned around, there was nothing. The woods were empty, the only sound my own breath coming in ragged bursts. I forced myself to shake it off. It was just the wind or an animal, I told myself. There was no one here. Still, something had changed. The air felt thicker, heavier. I hurried back to the cabin, my pace quickening with every step. Once inside, I locked the door behind me and tried to calm myself. The weird sensation of being watched still clung to me, and I couldn't ignore the fact that I hadn't seen a single living creature in the woods. Not even a bird. I spent the rest of the day inside, trying to distract myself with a book. The hours passed in a blur, and soon it was dark again. The air was colder now, and I couldn't stop thinking about the cloth, about the feeling in the woods. I had heard stories about the dangers of getting lost out there, how people could vanish without a trace, how the forest had a way of swallowing you whole. But I wasn't lost. I was fine. I just needed to sleep. That night, I woke up to the sound of scratching. At first, I thought it was a branch against the window, but when I listened closer, I realized it was coming from inside the cabin. My heart stopped. It was soft at first, just a faint noise, but then it grew louder, more deliberate. Someone or something was scratching at the walls. I grabbed my phone, the screen casting a faint glow in the dark room. I checked the time, 2:42 a.m. My hands shook as I dialed the number for the cabin's owner. No answer. I tried again. Nothing. The scratching continued, now accompanied by a faint thumping sound, like someone was pacing back and forth just beyond the walls. I could feel my pulse in my ears, the dread creeping over me like a thick fog. I told myself it was just an animal, a raccoon or something, maybe, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I waited in silence, trying to listen for any other sounds. After what felt like an eternity, the noise stopped. Everything went quiet again, but it wasn't the same as before. The silence felt unnatural, too quiet. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I was exhausted. My mind kept replaying the sounds from the night before. I had to get out of there. But when I went outside to pack up my things, I noticed something strange. The car's tires were flat, all 4 of them, and there was no sign of anything that could have caused it. No nails, no glass, no rocks. Just flat tires, like something had deliberately done it. I was trapped. The panic hit me then. I didn't know what was going on, but I had to get out. I couldn't stay here another minute. I grabbed my phone again, this time calling a tow truck. But again, no answer. I tried again and again, nothing. My mind raced as I looked around. The woods seemed closer now, the trees pressing in on me. I felt like they were closing in, like the walls of the cabin were shifting. I grabbed my bag, determined to hike out to the nearest road. But when I tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. It was stuck. I pulled, pushed, kicked, but it wouldn't open. I turned around, my eyes scanning the cabin for anything I could use to break the door down. But there was nothing, just old furniture, old pictures, and that heavy, oppressive silence. I started to panic, my breathing shallow and quick. What was happening? What was going on here? That's when I heard it again, the scratching. But this time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from inside the cabin, from the attic. I grabbed a chair, stood on it, and tried to push open the attic door. Creaked as I pried it loose. Inside, the space was dark and filled with old, forgotten things. Boxes, dusty furniture, and piles of things I couldn't make out in the dim light. But at the far end, something caught my eye. A figure, someone or something was standing in the shadows just beyond the light. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. And then, slowly, the figure stepped forward. It was a woman. She was tall, thin, with pale skin and wild, unkempt hair. She was wearing an old, tattered dress, like she had been living in the attic for years. But her eyes, they weren't right. They were wide, unblinking, and filled with an emptiness that made my blood run cold. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I could only watch as she took a step toward me, her feet making no sound on the floor. But then, something changed. The cabin didn't feel like it was closing in anymore. The air grew lighter, and the oppressive feeling lifted. The figure stopped moving. She didn't approach me, didn't make a sound. She just stood there, staring. And then, without another word, she turned and walked into the darkness of the attic, disappearing into the shadows. I didn't wait around. I shoved the attic door closed and ran down the stairs out of the cabin into the woods. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I found the road. The air felt different out there, fresher. The sun was setting again, but this time, I didn't feel alone. The woods were behind me now. Whatever had happened in that cabin stayed there. And as I reached the road, I finally saw a car passing by. I didn't look back. I was looking forward to this hike. There's something about nature that always calms me. Long stretches of forest, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and the freedom of just being alone with your thoughts. This trail, a moderately difficult one, was supposed to take me through some of the most scenic parts of the area. I'd read about it in hiking forums and seen pictures of the towering trees and sprawling views. It seemed perfect for a weekend trip. Just me, my pack, and the open trail. It was an early Saturday morning when I set out. The sun had barely risen, casting soft rays over the distant peaks. I was used to getting up early for hikes. It's when the air is freshest and the trail the least crowded. My backpack felt light, though I had packed all the essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a map. I always made sure to be prepared, even for unexpected situations. The weather was perfect, clear skies and mild temperatures. Nothing about the morning seemed off. The path started wide and smooth, winding through an area of thick trees. The air smelled earthy, rich with the scent of pine and damp soil. Birds chirped above, and every now and then, I'd hear a rustling in the underbrush. Likely squirrels or deer, nothing out of the ordinary. I walked at a steady pace, enjoying the solitude and the slow immersion into the forest. As I made my way deeper into the woods, the trail began to narrow. The trees grew taller and the forest denser. It felt quieter here, as if the world outside had fallen away. The only sounds were the occasional creak of a branch and my footsteps crunching along the gravel. I looked at the map on my phone. There was a fork coming up in about half a mile. It would be my first real decision of the hike, and I'd already decided I was going to take the less traveled path. Something about it called to me. It wasn't a difficult route, but fewer people seemed to take it, and that made it more appealing. I preferred quiet, peaceful hikes over the more popular routes that were often crowded with groups. When I reached the fork, I followed the smaller path, which veered off to the right. Almost immediately, the trail became steeper. The trees grew thicker, blocking out more of the sunlight, and the ground was covered in loose rocks and fallen leaves. The climb wasn't hard, but it was a bit of a workout. Sweat began to bead on my forehead as I pushed onward. The higher I went, the more the trail seemed to wind around the mountain, and the deeper I ventured into the woods. About an hour later, I stopped for a quick break. I sat on a large rock, sipping water and catching my breath. My phone showed no signal, no surprise, considering how far off the beaten path I had gone. I didn't mind, though. The isolation felt comforting. It was only then that I realized how silent everything had become. Normally, on a hike like this, you'd hear the occasional breeze rustling through the leaves, or maybe an animal moving through the underbrush. But now it was eerily quiet. I looked around, scanning the trees, but there was nothing. No movement, no noise, just stillness. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just part of the deep forest atmosphere. I stood up, stretched, and continued walking. The trail began to get rougher as I ascended, and I had to pay more attention to where I was stepping. I was still in good spirits, enjoying the challenge. The climb became steeper, and soon I was scrambling over loose rocks, using tree roots to pull myself up. There was a part of me that wondered if I should have stuck to the main trail, but I pushed those thoughts away. This was what I'd come for, this sense of raw adventure. After another hour or so, I noticed something strange. I wasn't sure what it was at first. It was a shift in the air, something subtle, but enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stopped, looking around. The forest was still as silent as before, but now there was a strange feeling that I wasn't alone. It was a subtle unease, a whisper of something just beyond my sight. I shook it off again, trying to focus on the trail ahead, but the feeling lingered. I continued upward, the incline becoming more challenging. My legs burned with effort, but I was determined to make it to the top. The higher I got, the harder it was to see the trail clearly. It had become a jumble of loose rocks, tree roots, and thick underbrush. The canopy above had thickened, blocking out more light, and soon, the trail became little more than a faint path through the forest. I checked my map, unsure if I was still on the right track. It was hard to tell. I was so far into the wilderness now that the landmarks I had hoped to rely on had disappeared. At some point, the trail seemed to fade completely. I stopped again, trying to get my bearings. My heart was beating a little faster now, not from exertion, but from something else. I glanced around and realized that the silence had deepened. The air felt thick, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. I decided to retrace my steps, thinking I had missed a turn or wandered off course. As I backtracked, the feeling of being watched intensified. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the trees made me pause and look around. But I saw nothing. My mind raced with thoughts. Was it just my nerves? Or was something out there? Maybe I was just being paranoid. Still, the unease wouldn't leave me. I pushed forward more cautiously now. It wasn't until much later that I realized I had lost track of time. The sun was low, and the light was fading fast. I hadn't made it back to the fork I'd passed earlier. Something wasn't right. The woods were eerily still, and my phone had been dead for a while now. I had no way of calling for help, no way to orient myself. Panic set in slowly. I tried to focus on the trail, looking for any familiar signs, but everything felt foreign. The trees, the rocks, the path, nothing looked the same as before. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I knew it was easy to get disoriented in the woods, especially when you're this far off the main trail. I could still hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I walked faster now, hoping to stumble across a clearing or some sign of civilization. But then, as I rounded a corner, I froze. Ahead of me, just at the edge of the trees, there was a figure. It was tall, thin, and completely still. Couldn't make out any details. My breath caught in my throat, and I stood frozen in place, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Could have been a tree or just the light playing tricks, but it didn't move. It was as if it were waiting. For what felt like forever, I just stared, too afraid to move. Then the figure took a slow step forward. I gasped and stepped back, heart racing. I was alone. There was no one else out here. I turned quickly, scrambling to get back to where I thought the trail had been, but I wasn't sure anymore. Every direction looked the same. My mind raced, thoughts swirling in a panic. The sun was almost gone now, and darkness was setting in. That was when I heard the voice. Faint, distant, and barely audible, but it was definitely there. "Hey!" I spun around, but saw nothing. My chest tightened. I wasn't sure what to do. I needed to get out of here. I turned back to the path and ran, slipping on rocks and roots. I didn't look back. My breath was ragged, and the fear was overwhelming. My heart thudded in my chest as I forced myself forward. It felt like hours before I finally stumbled back into the clearing where the fork had been. My legs were shaky, and I collapsed onto a nearby rock, gasping for air. I couldn't hear anything now. No footsteps, no voices, just silence. The oppressive feeling was gone. I checked my watch. Just over 3 hours had passed since I had started this whole ordeal. Somehow, I had been lost for hours when it felt like minutes. The hike out was uneventful. The forest seemed ordinary again, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. It was the longest hike I'd ever taken, and I couldn't explain what had happened or why I'd gotten lost. I didn't want to dwell on it, but when I finally reached the parking lot, I felt the weight lift off my shoulders. I was safe back where I belonged. It wasn't until later, as I was looking through the photos I had taken during the hike, that I noticed something strange in one of the pictures. A shadow in the background, just behind a tree, where no one had been when I took it. It made my blood run cold. I deleted the photo immediately. Some things were better left unexplained. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway. I had spent too many months in the city, trapped in the constant hum of traffic and the buzz of never-ending emails. So when I found this secluded cabin online, I thought it was the perfect escape. I didn't even need to look at the reviews. Just the pictures of the small, rustic cabin surrounded by towering trees were enough to convince me. No neighbors for miles, no noise except the sound of the wind through the leaves. I packed my bags and headed out the next morning. The drive was longer than expected. The directions weren't great, and I found myself following a narrow, winding road that seemed to go deeper and deeper into the woods. The trees were dense, their branches forming a canopy so thick that barely any sunlight reached the ground. The further I drove, the more I started to feel isolated. No other cars, no signs of civilization. By the time I finally reached the cabin, the sky was beginning to dim. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the landscape. The cabin itself was exactly as it had looked in the pictures. Small, made of dark wood with a rusty metal roof. There was a porch with an old rocking chair and a stone path leading to the door. Perfect little spot, tucked away from the world. I got out of the car, stretching my legs after the long drive, and looked around. The silence was thick, almost oppressive. All I could hear was the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional bird call in the distance. The cabin was surrounded by trees, some of them towering giants that seemed to stretch on forever. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on me, but it didn't scare me. If anything, it was calming. I grabbed my bags and headed inside. The door creaked when I opened it, and I was greeted by the smell of wood and dust. The interior was simple: an old couch, a small kitchen with a stove and fridge, a dining table by the window, and a small fireplace. Everything looked clean, but it had that slightly worn feeling, as if it hadn't been used in a while. The first night was peaceful. I lit a fire in the fireplace, made some simple dinner, and settled in with a book. The windows were covered with thick curtains, so I didn't notice how dark it had gotten outside until I stepped out onto the porch to get some fresh air. The night had fallen completely, and the stars were bright against the pitch-black sky. I stood there for a while, just breathing in the cool, crisp air, before heading back inside. I tried to sleep, but something was off. The silence wasn't comforting anymore. There was no sound of the usual night creatures. No frogs, no crickets, not even a breeze in the trees. Felt wrong, but I brushed it off. Maybe it was just the unfamiliar surroundings. I pulled the covers over me and forced myself to close my eyes. The next day, I woke up early. The sun had just risen, casting soft golden light through the curtains. I felt a little better, the odd feeling from the night before fading as I made my coffee and sat by the window, watching the trees sway in the breeze. The air was fresh, and everything felt peaceful again. I decided to go for a walk around the property, to stretch my legs and get a better look at the area. The cabin sat at the edge of a small clearing, with dense forest on all sides. There was a small creek that ran through the woods, and a trail that seemed to follow it. I walked down the path, listening to the gentle flow of water. The air smelled of earth and pine, and the sun filtering through the trees created a soft, dappled light on the ground. I don't know why, but I felt like I wasn't alone. Not that I saw anyone, but there was a sense of being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing just outside the edge of my vision. But no one was there. The day passed without incident. I spent most of it reading by the window, occasionally stepping outside to soak in the peace and quiet. As evening approached, I started to feel that unease again. The air grew heavier, and the stillness seemed more pronounced. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint why. That night, the silence was deafening. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the occasional creak of the house settling. The wind had picked up again, but it didn't bring the usual comfort. It sounded different, more urgent, as if the trees were whispering something just beyond my hearing. Then a sound, a knock. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it came from somewhere outside. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. I waited, straining my ears, but nothing came after that.
No footsteps. No voices.
I convinced myself it was just a branch tapping against the house, but the feeling of unease had returned, stronger than ever. I spent the rest of the night lying awake, staring into the darkness, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin. The next morning, I checked the porch to see if anyone had been there, but there was nothing. No signs of anyone, no footprints in the dust, nothing out of place. But something had shifted. I couldn't ignore the fact that I was starting to feel more and more on edge. Even during the day, when everything should have been fine, I felt like there was something just outside my view. I would catch glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing there. On the third day, I decided to leave. I packed my things and headed to the car, eager to get away from the oppressive stillness of the cabin. But when I reached the car, I realized something was wrong. The front tire was flat. I hadn't heard anything during the night, but there it was, completely deflated. Panic crept in. I had no cell service. The nearest town was miles away, and I didn't have the tools to fix a flat tire. I walked around the cabin, trying to calm myself down, but the silence had returned, heavier than ever. There was no one around. No one could help. I tried to make the best of it. I decided to check the cabin supplies, hoping there was something useful. That's when I noticed something strange. The door to the basement was slightly open. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even noticed it when I first arrived. There was no reason for it to be ajar. Against my better judgment, I opened it. The stairs led down into a small, musty room, cluttered with old furniture and boxes. Nothing unusual at first glance. But then I saw something. A small, weathered notebook lying on the floor, partially hidden under a pile of old newspapers. I picked it up, my hands shaking, and flipped it open. The pages were filled with scribbled notes, random thoughts, lists, drawings. But the last entry stopped me cold. They know you're here. They've been watching. Don't trust the walls. I felt my stomach drop. I closed the notebook and put it back where I had found it. My mind was racing now. The knocks, the feeling of being watched, the strange silences. I wasn't just imagining it. Someone had been here before me, someone who had been alone, just like me, but for much longer. I had to get out. I grabbed my bag and ran outside, looking for anything that might help. There had to be a way out of here. But then I heard it. A voice, faint and distant, carried on the wind. I stopped in my tracks. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It was low, like a murmur, just on the edge of hearing. I couldn't make out the words, but I felt the weight of it pressing against my chest. Whoever had been here before had left something behind, something that wasn't just in the house. It was in the land itself. The forest around me felt alive, watching, waiting. I ran back to the cabin, heart pounding in my chest. The tire still wasn't fixed, but I didn't care anymore. I wasn't waiting for help. I left that day. I didn't even take the time to gather everything. I didn't need to. I just got in the car, drove back down the narrow road, and didn't look back. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me until I reached the nearest town, and even then, I still felt unsettled. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know what happened there or who or what had been watching me, but I learned something that weekend. The woods have their own secrets, and some places are better left alone. I've always been the kind of person who likes quiet. I enjoy solitude, calm moments, and stretches of time alone, away from the noise of everything. When I hit the road that Friday evening, I wasn't thinking about anything more than getting to my destination. It was supposed to be a weekend trip, just me, my truck, and a cabin a few hours away. Nothing fancy, just some time to clear my head and disconnect. I left after work, the sun already starting to dip below the horizon as I packed a few essentials. A duffel bag, some snacks, bottled water, and my phone with a full battery. The cabin was in a quiet, remote part of the state. No cell service, but that was part of the appeal. I'd been there before once or twice. This time, though, I was going alone. The drive started out peaceful. The first couple of hours passed quickly, the hum of the tires on the road blending with the sound of the radio. Towns thinned out, traffic disappeared, and soon it was just me and miles of empty highway cutting through the countryside. The air was cool, the sky turning darker by the minute. By the time I hit the gravel road leading to the cabin, the sun had fully set. My headlights cut a narrow path through the dark, illuminating the trees lining both sides of the road. The forest felt thick and endless, pressing in on me from every angle. The gravel crunched beneath my tires, the sound echoing in the quiet. The cabin was still a good 20 minutes ahead, deep in the woods. I knew the way well enough not to worry, but something about how dark it was made me uneasy. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. No houses, no lights, just trees and more trees. I kept driving, trying to shake off the unease. The air felt colder, and the road seemed narrower than I remembered. I glanced at my phone, no signal, just as expected. I still had about half a tank of gas, which was more than enough to get me there and back the next day. Then, out of nowhere, my right front tire hit something. It wasn't a hard jolt, more like a sudden dip, but enough to throw me off for a second. I slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. My headlights barely lit up the trees ahead, casting long, flickering shadows. I left the engine running and stepped out to check. The air was colder than it should have been for early fall, and the smell of damp leaves filled my nose. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked to the front of the truck. The tire looked fine at first glance, but when I crouched down and ran my hand over it, I felt the problem. A long, jagged piece of metal sticking out of the side. Great, I muttered to myself. A flat tire in the middle of nowhere. I changed tires plenty of times before, so it wasn't a big deal, but the timing couldn't have been worse. I popped the tailgate and pulled out the spare and jack. The forest was dead silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. No wind, no animals, nothing. Just the sound of my own movements. I worked quickly, wanting to get back on the road as soon as possible. I jacked up the truck and loosened the lug nuts, keeping an eye on the shadows beyond the headlights. The trees seemed closer than before, their branches twisting like skeletal arms. I shook my head, trying to brush off the feeling. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. As I worked, I noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched. I glanced over my shoulder a couple of times, but there was nothing there, just darkness and trees. I focused on the tire, trying to ignore the knot of tension growing in my chest. The new tire was on in about 15 minutes. I tightened the last lug nut, lowered the truck, and tossed the tools back into the bed. When I turned to get back into the cab, I froze. The driver's side door was open. I stood there for a second, my heart pounding in my chest. I was sure I had closed it when I got out. I remembered the click of the latch, the weight of the door as I pushed it shut. But now it was wide open, the interior light casting a dull glow onto the gravel. I swallowed hard and walked toward the truck, my eyes darting around the trees. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything, but the air felt heavier, like something was pressing down on me. I reached the door and peeked inside. Nothing looked out of place. My bag was still on the passenger seat, my phone sitting on top of it. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe the door hadn't latched properly, and it swung open on its own. Yeah, that had to be it. I climbed back in, shut the door, this time making sure it was closed, and started the engine. The road ahead seemed darker than before. The trees pressed in closer, their branches arching overhead like a tunnel. I drove slowly, my eyes scanning the shadows. Every bump in the road made my stomach twist. I just wanted to get to the cabin, lock the door, and forget about this whole thing. About 10 minutes later, I saw something in the road ahead. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer or maybe a coyote. But as I got closer, I realized it was a backpack lying in the middle of the road. I slowed down, my headlights illuminating the worn fabric. It looked old and dirty, like it had been out here for a while. I stopped a few feet away and stared at it. There was no sign of anyone around, just the backpack sitting there, like it had been dropped or left behind. Part of me wanted to drive around it and keep going, but something about it nagged at me. What if someone was hurt? What if they needed help? I left the engine running and stepped out, leaving the driver's side door open this time. The cold air hit me like a slap, and the smell of damp earth filled my nose. I walked toward the backpack, my footsteps crunching on the gravel. When I reached it, I nudged it with my boot. It felt heavy, like it was full of something. I crouched down and unzipped the main compartment. Inside, I found clothes, a water bottle, and a flashlight. There was also a folded-up map and a small notebook. I picked up the notebook and flipped through it. Most of the pages were blank, but a few had short, handwritten notes. They were hard to read in the dim light, but one of them caught my eye. Don't stop. Keep moving. They watched from the trees. I felt a chill run down my spine. I looked around, the trees looming over me like silent sentinels. The darkness felt deeper, thicker. I shoved the notebook back into the backpack and stood up, my pulse racing. That's when I heard it. A soft rustling in the trees behind me. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, slow, like footsteps on dry leaves. I spun around, my eyes searching the shadows. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. No response, just the rustling growing closer. I backed toward the truck, my heart hammering in my chest. The rustling stopped, but the silence felt worse. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there, to run. I climbed back into the truck, slammed the door, and locked it. The engine was still running, and I floored the gas, the tires kicking up gravel as I sped down the road. The backpack lay on the passenger seat, its contents forgotten for the moment. My hands gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I didn't stop until I reached the cabin. When I pulled into the driveway, I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. The cabin was dark, the windows like empty eyes staring back at me. I grabbed the backpack and my duffel bag and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I turned on every light in the cabin, checking every room, every closet. Everything was empty, just as it should be. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I set the backpack on the kitchen table and pulled out the notebook again. This time, I read through every page. Most of the notes were short and cryptic. Stay quiet, don't trust the lights, they move at night. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak, every groan of the old cabin set my nerves on edge. I kept the flashlight and a kitchen knife by my side, my eyes never leaving the windows. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I felt a surge of relief. I grabbed my stuff, threw it back into the truck, and got the hell out of there. I never went back to that cabin. The air smelled like pine and damp soil as I parked my car at the trailhead. I had planned this camping trip for weeks. A weekend alone in the wilderness to clear my head. I needed it. Work had been relentless, and I was constantly stuck in traffic, offices, and screens. Out here, I just wanted some peace.
No phones, no distractions.
Just me, the trees, and the quiet. I slung my backpack over my shoulders, locked the car, and started hiking up the trail. It wasn't a tough hike, but it was long enough to break a sweat. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall trees, casting long shadows on the dirt path. The sound of my boots crunching against gravel was steady and calming, blending with the chirping of birds. I had downloaded a map of the area, so I knew exactly where I was going. A small clearing beside a lake about 4 miles in. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was already hanging low in the sky, painting everything in gold. The lake shimmered, and the air was cool and quiet. Perfect. I set down my pack and stretched, feeling the ache in my shoulders. I found a nice flat spot near the edge of the clearing and set up my tent. After the tent was up, I gathered some firewood from the edge of the trees and built a small fire. It crackled softly as I sat on a rock, eating a granola bar and watching the flames. The sky had darkened to deep blue, and the stars were starting to appear. It felt good to be out here, alone with nothing but the sounds of nature around me. The first sign that something was off happened just after sunset. I was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, when I heard it, branches snapping in the woods behind me. At first, I thought it might be a deer. I'd seen fresh tracks on the trail earlier. I turned my head and listened carefully. Another snap, then another. It wasn't the quick, light steps of a deer, though. This was slower, heavier, deliberate. I stood up, my eyes scanning the edge of the tree line. It was hard to see much in the dark, but I could just make out the faint outline of the trees. I waited, holding my breath, but the sound stopped. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was nothing. Probably just a raccoon or a porcupine rooting around. I sat back down and tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. An hour later, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. I decided to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, zipped up the flap, and lay down on my sleeping bag. The forest outside was dead silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, just silence. I closed my eyes, trying to sleep, but every little sound kept me on edge. The snapping branches, the heavy footsteps. My mind wouldn't let it go. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew something felt wrong. Sometime after midnight, I finally started to drift off. That's when I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and heavy, moving through the clearing. My eyes snapped open, and I lay perfectly still, my heart pounding. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I held my breath, listening. The only thing separating me from whatever was out there was a thin sheet of nylon. I could hear it breathing slow, steady breaths. I grabbed my knife from my pack, clutching it in my hand. My mind was racing. Who the hell was out here in the middle of nowhere, standing outside my tent? The breathing stopped, and for a few seconds there was complete silence. Then, without warning, the footsteps started again, circling the tent. Slow and deliberate, my pulse was hammering in my ears. I could feel the blood rushing through my body. The footsteps stopped again, right at the entrance of the tent. I tightened my grip on the knife, ready for whatever was about to happen. But nothing did. The seconds dragged on like hours. Then I heard the sound of retreating footsteps, moving back toward the tree line. I stayed frozen in place, listening until I couldn't hear them anymore. I didn't dare move. I lay there in the dark, clutching the knife, my eyes wide open. Sleep was out of the question. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and waiting. Every little noise made me jump. I kept imagining whoever or whatever it was coming back, standing outside the tent again. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I felt a surge of relief. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, my legs stiff and shaky. The clearing was quiet, bathed in soft morning light. There was no sign of anyone, but then I saw them, footprints in the dirt. Not animal tracks, human. They led from the tree line to my tent, circled around it, and then disappeared back into the woods. My stomach dropped. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, stuffing everything into my backpack with trembling hands. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. The hike back to the car was the longest 4 miles of my life. Every sound, every movement in the woods sent a jolt of fear through me. I kept glancing behind me, convinced that someone or something was following me. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car, I almost cried with relief. I tossed my pack into the back seat, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. My hands were still shaking as I started the engine and pulled onto the road. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back in civilization. Even now, I can't explain what happened that night. Maybe it was just some random hiker messing with me, but it didn't feel like that. Whoever or whatever it was, they knew I was out there. They watched me, and they wanted me to know they were there. I haven't been camping alone since, and I don't think I ever will again. I never thought camping could go so wrong. I've been on plenty of trips before. Nothing fancy, just me, the woods, and a weekend of peace and quiet. But this time, something felt off right from the start. I should have trusted that gut feeling. Maybe if I had, things wouldn't have spiraled the way they did. It all started with a last-minute plan. I had a free weekend and wanted to get away. Life had been chaotic lately. Work deadlines, social commitments, all the usual stuff that wears you down. I needed a break, some fresh air, and the kind of silence you can only find deep in the woods. I picked a spot I'd been to once before, a secluded area in the national forest about 2 hours from home. It wasn't a well-marked campsite, just a patch of woods I'd found through a hiking forum. Quiet, remote, perfect for what I needed. I packed light. A tent, sleeping bag, my old camping stove, enough food for 2 days, a knife, flashlight, some extra batteries, and a water filter. I always travel prepared, but not over the top. The drive was uneventful. I left early Saturday morning, stopping once for gas and coffee. The weather was perfect, clear skies, a slight breeze, and the temperature hovering in the mid-60s. Ideal camping weather. The forest road leading to the trailhead was rougher than I remembered. The dirt was loose, and there were deep ruts from recent rain. My car bounced and rattled as I made my way down, dust kicking up behind me. I was the only car there when I arrived. Good, that's what I wanted. I parked, shouldered my pack, and set off. The trail was faint but still visible. It wound through a dense forest of pines and oaks, the ground soft with fallen leaves. Birds called from high in the branches, and the smell of pine sap filled the air. I walked for about an hour, maybe more, before finding a spot to set up camp. It was a small clearing with just enough flat ground for my tent. A fallen tree nearby would serve as a decent bench, and there was a little stream a short walk downhill. Perfect. I set up my tent, unpacked my gear, and gathered some firewood. I wasn't planning on a big fire, just enough to cook dinner and keep me warm as the evening chill set in. By late afternoon, everything was ready. I boiled some water for a dehydrated meal, ate slowly, and watched the sunlight filter through the trees. Time seemed to stretch out in that peaceful way it does when you're far from the noise of everyday life. As the sun dipped lower, I built a small fire. I sat there for hours, feeding it occasionally, lost in thought. The woods were quiet, aside from the crackling flames and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. The stars came out, brighter than I'd seen in months. Around 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I doused the fire, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and lay there listening to the sounds of the forest. I fell asleep quickly. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. First, I thought it was part of a dream, but no, there it was again. Soft, deliberate, crunching through the leaves just outside my tent. My heart started pounding. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. But something about the rhythm of those steps felt wrong. Too steady, too slow. I held my breath, straining to listen. The steps circled my tent, pausing now and then. Crunch, crunch, stop. Silence. Then they started again, closer this time. My hand crept toward my knife. I gripped it tightly, my palms slick with sweat. The footsteps stopped right next to my tent. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing, fast and shallow. Then, slowly, the zipper of my tent started to move. I lunged, slashing at the fabric with my knife, yelling as loud as I could. There was a thud, a scuffle, and the footsteps retreated, crashing through the underbrush. I scrambled out of the tent, my flashlight in one hand, knife in the other, heart racing. I swept the beam of light across the trees, but there was no sign of whoever or whatever it was. My tent was torn, the zipper half open. I stood there, shivering in the cold night air, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who the hell had been out here? Why were they messing with my tent? I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the fire, knife in my lap, scanning the darkness for any movement. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. The first light, I packed up. I wasn't about to stick around and find out what that was all about. My hands were shaking as I stuffed my gear into my pack. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. The hike back to my car felt longer than it should have. Every sound made me jump. I kept my knife in hand, the blade slick with morning dew. When I finally reached the trailhead, my car was just where I'd left it. Relief washed over me as I climbed in and locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath. I started the engine and turned onto the forest road, eager to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. But about a mile down the road, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Another set of tire tracks, fresh ones, leading into the woods. I wasn't alone out there. Someone else had been nearby, someone who'd arrived after me. I drove faster, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. I didn't slow down until I was back on the main highway, the forest far behind me. It's been months since that trip, but I still think about it. I've told myself it was probably just some other camper, maybe a hunter who got too curious for their own good. But deep down, I know that's not true. I haven't been camping since. Maybe I'll go back someday. Maybe not. One thing's for sure, I'll never forget that night. It started as a simple trip, just a weekend out in the woods to escape the noise and stress of everyday life. I'd always liked being outdoors. There was something about the quiet, the smell of pine and damp earth, that helped clear my head. I packed light tent, sleeping bag, some basic food, a flashlight, and a knife. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, a little cool at night, but nothing that worried me. I had planned on hiking about 6 miles into the forest to a remote campsite I'd read about online. Supposedly, it was peaceful and rarely visited. Just what I needed. I parked my car at the trailhead, double-checked my backpack, and set off around mid-morning. The first few miles were easy, the trail well-marked and smooth. Birds were chirping, and I could hear the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Occasionally, I'd pass a stream or a small clearing where the sunlight poured in, lighting everything up in a soft golden glow. It felt like I had the whole place to myself. I stopped a couple of times to drink water and take in the scenery, but I kept moving, wanting to get to the campsite with enough daylight left to set up and gather firewood. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. The birdsong faded, and the trees grew thicker, their branches intertwining overhead and blocking out most of the light. The air felt heavier, damp and cool, with that earthy smell that comes from layers of rotting leaves and moss-covered logs. It wasn't exactly creepy, but it had an edge to it. Something about being that far out alone makes you hyper-aware of every sound, every movement around you. I reached the campsite around mid-afternoon. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall trees, with a fire pit made of stones in the center and just enough flat ground for my tent. There was no sign anyone had been there recently, no footprints, no trash, nothing. I set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and started gathering wood for a fire. By the time the sun began to set, I had a decent pile of wood and a small fire crackling in the pit. I cooked some instant noodles, ate in silence, and sat by the fire for a while, watching the flames dance and listening to the night settle in around me. It was peaceful. No cars, no people, just the sound of the wind in the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves. As darkness fully settled, the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees looked like walls, their trunks black against the dim light of the fire. I felt exposed sitting there in the middle of that clearing, so I put out the fire and crawled into my tent. It wasn't much of a barrier, just a thin layer of nylon, but it made me feel a little safer. I fell asleep quickly, the exhaustion from the hike catching up with me. But at some point in the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. I lay there in the dark, listening. It was dead silent outside. No wind, no insects, nothing. That kind of silence makes your ears strain, trying to pick up anything, even the faintest sound. Then I heard it, a soft crunch. It was faint, but unmistakable. The sound of a footstep on dry leaves, just outside my tent. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I held my breath, listening. Another crunch, closer this time. I reached slowly for my knife, my fingers closing around the handle. I didn't move otherwise. I just lay there, straining to hear where the sound was coming from. Crunch. It was circling my tent, the footsteps slow and deliberate, like whoever or whatever. Didn't care if I heard them. I wanted to believe it was an animal. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. This was a person. I kept my grip on the knife and waited. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent, just inches from my head. I could hear breathing now, slow and steady. Whoever it was, they were just standing there, listening. My mind raced. Should I yell? Try to scare them off? Or stay quiet and hope they went away? The breathing continued for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Then, without warning, the footsteps started again, moving away from the tent. Crunch, crunch, crunch. They faded into the distance until all I could hear was my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. I lay there for a long time, knife in hand, waiting to see if they would come back. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off into a restless sleep. When I woke up, it was just before dawn. The sky was a pale gray, and the forest was waking up around me. Birds chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze. It almost felt normal. Almost. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, my knife still in my hand. The ground was covered in dry leaves, but there were clear footprints circling the tent. They were fresh, the edges still sharp. Definitely not an animal. I packed up quickly, my eyes constantly scanning the trees. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like I was being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. The hike back to the car was the longest 6 miles of my life. I didn't stop, didn't take a break, just kept moving as fast as I could without breaking into a full-on run. My pulse pounded in my ears the entire time, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car, I almost cried from relief. I threw my backpack in the back seat, locked the doors, and sat there for a minute, catching my breath. I never saw who it was, never found out what they wanted or why they were out there in the middle of nowhere, walking around my tent in the middle of the night. But I do know one thing: I'm never going camping alone again. I don't usually hike alone, not because I'm scared or anything, but because it's just safer to have someone around in case something goes wrong. My best friend Steve was supposed to join me that weekend, but he bailed at the last minute because of work. I should have taken that as a sign and stayed home, but I was stubborn. I'd already planned everything: gear packed, water bottles filled, trail map downloaded. So I figured, why waste a perfectly good weekend? It was late October, and the weather was perfect for hiking. Chilly but not freezing, leaves changing colors, sky a pale blue with just a few clouds hanging lazily overhead. My plan was to hike a loop trail in the mountains that stretched about 12 miles. I'd done parts of it before, but never the full loop. It wasn't one of those well-known trails with lots of hikers. It was tucked away, quieter, less maintained. That's what drew me to it, the solitude. I parked my car at the trailhead around 8 a.m., laced up my boots, threw on my backpack, and set off. The first few miles were beautiful. The trail wound through thick forest, the kind that makes you feel completely cut off from the world. The leaves crunched under my feet, and the air smelled like pine and damp earth. I kept a steady pace, stopping occasionally to take a sip of water or snap a picture of some particularly vivid red or orange leaves. Around mile 5, things started to change. The trees grew denser, and the trail became harder to follow. Fallen leaves covered everything, making it difficult to see where the path actually was. I found myself constantly scanning the ground for the faint line of dirt that marked the trail, but sometimes it just disappeared altogether. I told myself it was no big deal. I had my map, my compass, and plenty of daylight left. Worst case scenario, I could backtrack and find my way back to the main trail. But the farther I went, the less confident I felt. I hadn't seen a trail marker in a while, and the landscape all looked the same: endless trees and fallen leaves. At some point, I must have taken a wrong turn because I found myself standing in front of a steep ravine that definitely wasn't on the map. I could hear water trickling somewhere down below, but I couldn't see it through the thick undergrowth. I pulled out my map and tried to figure out where I was. The problem was, without any clear landmarks, it was almost impossible to tell. The ravine wasn't marked, and neither was the faint trail I'd been following. I decided to head back the way I'd come, but after about 10 minutes, I realized I couldn't find the trail anymore. Panic started to bubble up in my chest, but I pushed it down. Panicking wouldn't help. I took a deep breath, focused on staying calm. I had a general sense of the direction I needed to go, so I started walking, keeping the sun on my left to guide me. That worked for a while, until the sun started to dip below the treetops and the light began to fade. The temperature dropped quickly, and I pulled on my jacket, trying to ignore the gnawing sense of dread growing in my stomach. I kept moving, trying to stay positive. Every step took me closer to the trail. I just had to keep going. But the forest felt different now, darker, quieter. Even the birds had gone silent. After another hour of walking, it was clear I wasn't getting any closer to the trail. I stopped, leaning against a tree, my breath visible in the cold air. My legs were sore, my feet aching from walking over uneven ground. I checked my phone, no signal, of course. I weighed my options. I could keep moving and risk getting even more lost in the dark, or I could set up camp for the night and try again in the morning. It wasn't an easy decision, but ultimately, staying put seemed safer. I found a relatively flat spot between two trees and set up my small tent. I wasn't planning to spend the night, so I didn't have much in the way of supplies. Just a thin emergency blanket, a granola bar, and a small flashlight. I gathered some dry leaves and branches to make a small fire, more for comfort than warmth, and sat down to eat my granola bar, listening to the crackling flames. The forest around me felt oppressive in the darkness. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made my heart race. I told myself it was just animals, squirrels, maybe a deer, but it didn't help. My imagination ran wild, conjuring up every possible worst-case scenario. The hours dragged on. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard something. A faint footstep, the rustle of leaves just beyond the edge of the firelight. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was off. Around 2 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the tent, shining the beam into the darkness. The fire had died down to a few glowing embers, casting just enough light to make the surrounding trees look like twisted shadows. And that's when I saw it. Footprint, not an animal track. A human footprint, pressed into the soft dirt just a few feet from my tent. It was fresh. My blood went cold. I hadn't seen or heard anyone else all day. There shouldn't have been anyone out here, especially not in the middle of the night. I scanned the darkness, heart pounding, every instinct screaming at me to run. But where would I go? I was lost in the middle of nowhere, and whoever had made that footprint could be anywhere. I backed slowly into the tent, zipped it up, and grabbed the small knife I kept in my backpack. I sat there for what felt like hours, clutching the knife, ears straining for any sound. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Pale sunlight filtered through the trees, and the forest looked almost peaceful again. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The footprint was still there, a chilling reminder that I hadn't imagined it. I started walking, moving as fast as I could without running. My only goal was to get back to the trail, back to civilization. I didn't care about the loop anymore, I just wanted out. After about an hour, I heard it, the faint hum of a car engine. I almost cried with relief. I stumbled toward the sound, and suddenly, there it was, the trailhead parking lot. My car was the only one there. I threw my pack into the back seat, started the engine, and didn't stop driving until I was miles away. To this day, I don't know who or what left that footprint. I never went back to that trail, and I never hike alone anymore. Some people say I overreacted, that it was probably just another hiker who'd wandered by during the night. Maybe they're right, but I'll never forget that feeling, the cold certainty that I wasn't alone out there, and I'm not willing to take that chance again. I love camping. I've done it countless times, sometimes solo, sometimes with friends. The isolation, the fresh air, the quiet, there's nothing quite like it. I thought I was prepared for everything the wilderness could throw at me. I was wrong. This story isn't about some ghost or creature lurking in the woods. It's about something far more real and far more terrifying. It started with a weekend trip to a place called Devil's Ridge. A little dramatic for a name, sure, but it was remote, and that's what I wanted, complete solitude for a couple of days. I had just finished a brutal few weeks at work and needed some peace and quiet. No phone, no emails, no people. Just me, the trees, and my tent. I packed light but smart, tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, plenty of water, a knife, a first aid kit, a headlamp, and my reliable old hiking boots. My phone was fully charged, but there wouldn't be any service out there. I didn't mind. The less connected I was, the better. The drive out took about 4 hours. The last hour was a bumpy dirt road that wound its way up into the mountains. By the time I reached the trailhead, it was late afternoon. The sky was clear, and the sun was starting to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. I slung my pack over my shoulders, locked the car, and set off down the trail. The plan was to hike about 5 miles in, set up camp near a small creek I'd marked on my map, and spend the weekend exploring the area. The trail was well-worn but empty. No other hikers in sight. Perfect. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional bird call. After about an hour, I reached the creek. It was exactly as I'd imagined. Clear, cold water running over smooth rocks, surrounded by tall pines. I found a flat spot a few yards from the water and set up camp. The air was cool, but not cold. The smell of pine and damp earth filled my nose. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got a small fire going. Dinner was simple, dehydrated chili and a granola bar. I ate slowly, enjoying the quiet and the crackle of the fire. As the sun sank behind the mountains, the shadows deepened and the forest grew dark. I watched the fire until it burned down to embers, then crawled into my tent. I zipped up my sleeping bag and closed my eyes. I woke up to the sound of something snapping in the woods, a branch maybe 20 yards away. My eyes shot open. It was pitch black inside the tent, and for a moment I wasn't sure where I was. Then it came back to me, Devil's Ridge, the creek, the tent. I listened, holding my breath. Crunch. Another sound. Closer this time. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Not an animal. I've been in the woods enough to know what a deer or a raccoon sounds like. This was different. Heavy. Human. My heart started to race. I told myself it was probably another camper. Maybe they'd lost the trail and were trying to find their way back. But something about the way the footsteps moved didn't feel right. They were too slow, too careful. I reached for my headlamp and clicked it on. The inside of the tent lit up, but I couldn't see anything beyond the thin fabric. The footsteps had stopped. The only sound was the creek, gurgling softly in the dark. I waited, straining to hear anything else. Minutes passed. Nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid. I'd been out here all day without seeing a single soul. What were the chances someone would just happen to stumble across my camp in the middle of the night? I took a deep breath, turned off the headlamp, and lay back down. I didn't sleep. The next morning, everything felt normal again. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and the forest looked almost friendly in the daylight. I told myself the footsteps had just been my imagination. Maybe a tree branch falling, or some animal I didn't recognize. I spent the day hiking and exploring the area. I found an old logging road that hadn't been used in years, followed it for a while, then looped back toward camp. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd stop and look around, but there was never anyone there, just trees and shadows. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I'd spooked myself the night before and was jumping at shadows. By the time I got back to camp, it was late afternoon. I built another fire, boiled some water for instant noodles, and tried to relax. As the sun set, the unease returned. The shadows grew longer, and the friendly forest from earlier in the day turned dark and silent. I kept the fire going longer than usual, feeding it stick after stick until I had a roaring blaze. I sat with my back to the tent, facing the woods, listening. Nothing. Eventually, the fire burned down to embers. I considered staying up all night, but I was exhausted. I crawled into the tent, leaving the headlamp on this time. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. I woke up to the sound of footsteps again, closer this time. My heart was pounding in my chest. I sat up, gripping the knife I'd left next to my sleeping bag. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent. I held my breath, listening. A faint rustling sound. Someone or something was brushing against the side of the tent. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. My mind was racing. What the hell was I supposed to do? Burst out of the tent and confront whoever was out there? Stay inside and hope they went away? The rustling stopped. The footsteps started again, moving away from the tent, back toward the woods. I waited, counting the seconds. 10, 20, 30. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and stepped outside, knife in hand. The fire had burned down to ashes, and the forest was dark. My headlamp cast a narrow beam of light that barely pierced the shadows. There was no one there. I scanned the trees, my pulse hammering in my ears. The forest was silent, watching. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. To first light, I packed up my gear. I wasn't sticking around to find out what or who had been outside my tent. I hiked back to the trailhead as fast as I could, my head on a swivel the whole time. Every snapping branch, every rustling leaf sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack in the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I turned the key and started the engine. As I drove back down the dirt road, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the trees behind me. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the endless forest. It wasn't until I hit the highway that I started to feel safe again. Looking back, I don't know what really happened out there. Maybe it was just some random hiker who didn't realize how creepy they were being. Maybe it was something worse. I'll never know. What I do know is this: I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will. I decided to go hiking on a trail I hadn't tried before. It was one of those that wasn't too popular, mostly known by locals and a few experienced hikers. People always said it was peaceful, calm, and quiet, which sounded perfect to me. I'd been feeling overwhelmed with everything: work, life, just the usual noise, and a solo hike seemed like the perfect way to clear my mind. I packed light, just a small backpack with water, a sandwich, a first aid kit, and a flashlight. I didn't need anything else. The day was bright, sunny, and there was a slight breeze. It felt like the perfect day for a hike. The trailhead was small, just an old signpost with the name of the trail painted on it. No fancy markings, no welcoming words, just an arrow pointing into the woods. I could see where the trail began, a thin path that cut into the thick trees. It was a well-worn path, so it didn't look like it would be too difficult to follow. I adjusted my backpack and started walking. First, the trail was easy. The ground was packed dirt, the trees high above, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. Birds chirped in the distance, and the soft crunch of leaves under my boots was the only sound. I kept my eyes on the trail, my pace steady, my thoughts drifting. The path twisted and turned, and soon the trees closed in around me, blocking out the sunlight. The air grew cooler, and the sounds of the outside world started to fade away. I was deep in the woods now, the trail winding through thick foliage. Felt like I was in a different world. The peacefulness was almost unsettling. No other hikers, no animals, just me and the path ahead. The silence felt too thick, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. The deeper I went, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Not in a supernatural way, just in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. After about an hour of walking, I reached a small clearing. It wasn't much, just a patch of grass surrounded by tall trees. But as I stepped into the clearing, something caught my attention. There was a strange mark on one of the trees, a series of cuts, almost like a symbol. It wasn't deep, just shallow scratches, but they looked deliberate. I frowned and took a step closer, wondering if it was from another hiker or maybe some sort of animal. But the pattern didn't look natural. It looked intentional, like someone had made it. I quickly snapped a photo with my phone, just to remember it, then turned away. The air felt heavy here, and I felt a sudden urge to move on. I checked the time on my phone. It was just past noon, and I still had a few hours before I needed to head back. I wanted to make the most of it, so I took a deep breath and kept walking. The trail became more rugged after the clearing. The dirt path was uneven, with rocks and roots sticking up from the ground. The trees became denser, and I had to duck under branches that reached out like fingers. I was still alone, and the thought crossed my mind again. Why hadn't I passed anyone yet? Even if the trail wasn't well known, it was still a public hike. It didn't make sense that I hadn't seen a single soul. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out to check. It was a text from a friend asking how the hike was going. I quickly typed back that everything was fine, then checked the time. It was nearly 2 p.m., but I didn't feel like it had been that long since I started. The woods seemed to distort time in some strange way. I stuffed my phone back into my pocket and continued walking, now acutely aware of the silence. There were no birds chirping, no rustling in the underbrush, nothing. Just the sound of my boots on the trail and the occasional creak of tree branches above. It was like the forest had become a living, breathing thing, and it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I came across another oddity about 20 minutes later. There was a small creek crossing the trail, the water clear and fast-moving. But there, on the edge of the water, was another symbol carved into a stone. It looked similar to the one on the tree, but this one was on a flat rock, the edges jagged and rough. I crouched down, studying it. There was no way this was natural. It was too deliberate, too precise. It almost looked like some kind of warning. But for what? I stood up quickly, my unease growing. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Maybe some kids had been out here messing around. But why would they go so far out on a quiet trail like this? My mind wandered, thinking about all the stories I'd heard growing up, about strange things happening in the woods, about people getting lost, about hikers who just disappeared. I shook my head, dismissing the thoughts. There was no reason to panic. This was just a hike, and I was just overthinking things. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, and the air was growing cooler. I glanced up ahead. The trail curved around a bend, and I could see the darkening forest stretching out before me. My instincts told me it was time to turn back, but there was something about the way the trail looked ahead that drew me in. I wanted to see where it went, so I pushed on, though my pace quickened, as if I was trying to outrun the growing discomfort gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. The trail seemed to narrow as I walked, the trees pressing closer together. The further I went, the more the atmosphere changed. It wasn't just the silence anymore. It was the feeling that something was there, watching. I wasn't sure how to explain it, but it felt like the woods were alive, like the trees and the rocks and the earth itself were all aware of my presence. Then suddenly the trail came to an abrupt stop. There was no warning, no sign of where the path had gone. Just thick brush, tangled vines, and a steep drop-off to one side. I frowned, confused. I couldn't have walked this far and just hit a dead end. I turned around, scanning the area for another path, but the way back looked just as confusing as the way forward. The trail had disappeared. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself. There had to be a way out of this. I pulled out my phone to check the map, but the screen was black. I pressed the power button, trying to get it to turn on, but it didn't respond. My stomach dropped. I was completely out of signal. I shoved the phone back into my pocket and started walking along the edge of the brush, hoping to find some sign of where the trail continued. The more I walked, the more I realized how quiet it was. It was like the world had gone still. Not even the wind was moving. I could feel my heart pounding, my breath shallow, but I kept going, hoping I'd find a way out. Then, I noticed something, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. It was quick, too quick to be sure, but I swore I saw something dark just beyond the trees. My first instinct was to ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. I took a few cautious steps toward where I had seen the movement. That's when I heard it, a soft rustling sound, like footsteps, moving through the underbrush. My blood ran cold. There was no one else out here, not until now. I stood frozen, my body tense, trying to figure out what was happening. The rustling stopped, and then silence again. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if I was being suffocated by the very woods themselves. I needed to get out. Panic surged through me. I started running, pushing through the underbrush, stumbling over rocks, not caring about anything except getting away from whatever was out there. I didn't look back, couldn't. The rustling followed me, growing closer, but I didn't dare stop. My legs burned. My lungs screamed for air, but I kept pushing forward. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the rustling stopped. I slowed down, my breath ragged, my eyes darting around, but there was nothing, no sound, no movement, just the stillness of the woods. I didn't wait to analyze it. I turned and ran back, retracing my steps until I finally found the trail again. I didn't stop running until I reached the trailhead, where the sunlight filtered through the trees and the world felt normal again. My heart was still pounding in my chest, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was gone. I made it back to my car and sat there for a long time, just staring at the trees, trying to make sense of everything. But no matter how hard I thought about it, I couldn't explain what had happened. I was just thankful to be out of the woods, safe. It was the last time I ever went hiking alone. I was never really the outdoorsy type, but I thought a solo hike might be just what I needed. I had been feeling a little disconnected from everything lately. Work, friends, and even my own thoughts. A weekend away from all the noise seemed like the perfect solution. So I packed a backpack with the essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a map. I wasn't aiming for anything too crazy, just a few hours on a well-marked trail in the nearby forest. The air was cool, the sun was out, and the idea of being alone in nature sounded peaceful. The trail started off easy, just a narrow path winding through the trees. The crunch of the dirt and leaves under my boots was soothing, and the quiet around me felt different from the usual noise of the city. There was something special about being surrounded by nothing but trees, sky, and the occasional bird call. I was only a couple of miles in when I realized how isolated I was. The sounds of civilization seemed to fade away, replaced by the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush or the wind moving through the leaves. After a while, the trail became less clear. At first, I chalked it up to the fact that it was a less traveled route, but soon the path was barely visible. It was strange because I had checked the map earlier, and this part was supposed to be easy to follow. I hesitated for a moment. There were no other hikers around, no one to ask for directions. But the thought of turning back felt like giving up, and I wasn't ready to do that. I pushed forward, hoping I'd find a way back to the main trail soon enough. The trees began to close in around me. The sky above, once bright and clear, was now mostly blocked by the dense canopy. The temperature started to drop, and I regretted not bringing an extra layer. My breath came out in little clouds as I moved deeper into the woods. It was strange. Everything felt different now. The forest had gone quiet, almost too quiet. No more bird songs, no more rustling. Just silence. I pulled out my map again, trying to reassure myself that I was still on the right track. The little squiggly lines marking the trails were hard to make out in the dim light, and I found myself squinting. I had always trusted my sense of direction, but now that I was out here, I started to feel unsure. My heart rate picked up, and I found myself glancing around nervously. My instincts, which had always served me well in the city, were suddenly on high alert. The path grew more uneven, with roots and rocks sticking up from the ground. It made walking more difficult, and I had to slow down. There was something about the way the forest seemed to close in on me that was starting to get under my skin. The trees weren't just trees anymore. They felt like they were watching, looming, almost like they were crowding in from every side. As I pushed forward, I thought I heard something in the distance. It was faint at first, just a soft shuffling sound, like someone or something was moving through the brush. My mind immediately went to worst-case scenarios, as it often did. Was it another hiker? An animal? My eyes darted in every direction, but the trees were thick, and I couldn't see anything beyond a few feet in front of me. The sound stopped. I stood still for a moment, listening carefully. My breath was shallow, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind or an animal moving around. But the longer I stood there, the more the silence around me seemed oppressive, heavy. I decided to move on, faster this time. My footfalls were louder, more hurried than before. The path twisted and turned, and I found myself climbing slightly, the ground becoming more uneven. The temperature continued to drop, and the air started to feel thick, like it was harder to breathe. I had no idea how far I had walked at this point. The light was fading too, and I realized that I had been so focused on the trail that I hadn't even noticed how quickly the day was slipping away. The panic started to set in. I had no signal on my phone, no way to call for help. The trees were dense, and I could barely see anything beyond a few feet in front of me. I reached for my water bottle, but I was down to just a few sips left. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten much since breakfast. I was getting tired, frustrated, and a little scared, and then I heard it again. The sound. This time it was closer, much closer. I froze, holding my breath. It was a distinct sound now, a rustling in the brush, followed by the sound of something heavy moving through the undergrowth. My pulse quickened. I was no longer alone. I told myself it was just an animal, but my gut was telling me something different. I slowly looked around, trying to stay calm. The trees all looked the same, tall, dark, and unmoving. I had no idea where the sound was coming from, and it was driving me crazy. I started walking again, faster this time. I didn't know what I was running from, but something told me I needed to get back to the main trail and fast. The path opened up into a small clearing, and I stopped, breathless. The light was now almost completely gone, the shadows stretching long and dark across the ground. I stood there for a moment, my mind racing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, a primal sense of danger flooding over me. Something wasn't right. The air felt thick, like it was pressing in from all sides. And then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw something, a figure, standing on the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the fading light. Person, or what I thought was a person. I couldn't see their face, but the shape was too still, too quiet. My heart thudded in my chest as I stared at it. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was as if they were waiting for me to make the next move. I turned, desperate now, my feet slipping on the uneven ground as I stumbled away. I didn't look back. I knew I had to get out of there. The panic was overwhelming now, my breath shallow and rapid, my head spinning. I had no idea where I was going, but I couldn't stop. My foot caught on a root and I went down hard, the impact jarring my whole body. Pain shot through my knee, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I just lay there, gasping for air, listening for the sound of footsteps, the rustle of leaves, anything that might indicate someone or something was coming closer. I pushed myself up, ignoring the pain in my leg, and stumbled forward, my senses on high alert. Every noise seemed amplified now. The wind in the trees, my own footsteps, the beating of my heart. Finally, after what felt like hours, I broke through the trees and found the main trail. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I didn't even look back. I just ran, as fast as I could, until I reached the parking lot. It wasn't until I was safely in my car, the engine running, that I allowed myself to calm down. The terror that had gripped me slowly began to fade, replaced by a strange sense of relief. But even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been following me, waiting for me to let my guard down. Took me a while to process everything. Was it just my imagination? Was it exhaustion? Or had I actually encountered something out there? Something that wasn't right? I'll never know for sure. But one thing's for certain, I won't be going back out there alone anytime soon. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, just a short drive to get away from the noise, the constant buzz of the city, the stress of work. I found the cabin online. The listing said it was remote, nestled deep in the woods with no neighbors for miles. The pictures were beautiful, just the kind of place I thought I could relax and clear my head. A cozy log cabin surrounded by dense trees, a small lake nearby, and a sense of isolation that I thought would be refreshing. It seemed perfect for what I needed. The drive there took longer than I expected. The GPS kept cutting out as I got deeper into the woods, and the road became less of a road and more of a dirt path. The trees were thick, their trunks so close together that it felt like I was driving through a green tunnel. I hadn't seen another car in hours. The air smelled different here, fresher, but also damp, like the earth had been soaked for days. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I felt like something was watching me, but I brushed it off. My mind was just playing tricks. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked exactly like in the pictures. Rustic, charming, with a small porch that overlooked the lake. It was the kind of place that felt like it was stuck in time. I could hear the soft chirping of crickets, the rustling of the trees, and the occasional splash of a fish in the lake. Everything felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. I unpacked my car and brought in my things. It wasn't long before I had the fire going inside and the cabin felt warm. I could hear the crackle of the wood as the flames danced. I made myself a cup of tea and settled into one of the armchairs by the window, watching the sun begin to set over the water. It looked like the kind of sunset you only see in pictures, pink and orange streaks across the sky. For a moment, I thought maybe this weekend would be just what I needed. As night fell, the air grew colder. The only sounds were the fire in the hearth and the occasional gust of wind outside. I wrapped myself in a blanket and turned off the lights, letting the fire provide the only glow in the room. I could hear the wind howling through the trees now, a constant low moan that seemed to shake the walls. It didn't bother me at first, But as the hours wore on, it started to get to me. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. The bed was comfortable, the sheets cool against my skin. But as I lay there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The wind outside was louder now, and every now and then I thought I heard something scratching at the walls, just soft enough that it could have been the trees rubbing against the cabin. Still, the sound made me uneasy. I tried to ignore it, closing my eyes and taking deep breaths. I was in the middle of nowhere, and there was no reason to be scared. Yet, the sense of isolation felt heavier now. The idea that there was nothing around for miles. The nearest town was an hour away, the nearest person even further. It was quiet here, too quiet. It made me feel exposed, like I was too far from safety. Eventually, I fell asleep, but it didn't last long. The sound of something scraping at the window woke me. At first, I thought it was just the wind again, but then I heard it, sharp, deliberate, like fingernails on glass. My heart started pounding as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. It was hard to tell where the sound was coming from, but it felt close, too close. I got out of bed and crept to the window, my pulse racing in the silence. Outside, the trees were dark shadows, the night swallowing up everything beyond the porch. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the lake shimmered faintly, reflecting the little light that made it through. But there was nothing there. I told myself it was just an animal, a raccoon, or some other small creature, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to lock the windows and double-check the doors, just to be sure. When I did, I noticed something strange. There was dirt on the doorknob, like someone had been standing there, pressing against it, but I hadn't seen anyone. I hadn't heard any footsteps. My mind raced. Maybe it was just a mistake. Maybe I was being paranoid, but I couldn't ignore the feeling creeping up my spine. I went back to bed but couldn't sleep. The noise outside had stopped, but now I couldn't stop thinking about it. I lay there in the dark, listening to the wind, trying to calm my thoughts. But every time I closed my eyes, the image of that dirt on the doorknob kept coming back. In the morning, I went outside to clear my head. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky with shades of gold and pink. The lake looked peaceful, and the trees were still. But as I walked around the cabin, I noticed something odd. There were fresh footprints in the mud leading up to the porch. They weren't there the night before, I was sure of it. The prints were deep, like someone had been walking around the cabin for hours, pacing back and forth. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. It wasn't just that there were footprints, it was the fact that they were fresh. No one had passed by here in days. I hadn't seen anyone, I hadn't heard anyone. And yet here they were, large, heavy prints in the soft mud. I backed away from the porch and stood still, trying to think. My phone had no signal, of course. The cabin was supposed to be off the grid, but that meant I was completely isolated. I didn't want to panic, but the evidence was there. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching me. For the next couple of hours, I tried to convince myself I was just overreacting. Maybe it was just some hikers or campers who had passed through. Maybe they had stayed the night, not realizing the cabin was occupied. But the more I thought about it, the less likely that seemed. The prints weren't from a casual walk. They were deliberate, heavy. They didn't look like someone passing through. They looked like someone who had been waiting. By mid-afternoon, I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. The thought of being alone in that cabin, with the strange noises and the footprints, was too much. I packed up my things quickly, more hastily than I would have liked. The whole time, I felt like someone was just outside the window, watching, waiting. The cabin felt suffocating now, like it had turned against me. I was halfway to my car when I heard it again, the soft scratching at the window. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. I turned slowly, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. The window was shut tight, the glass still. I quickly jumped into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine, desperate to leave. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following me, or worse, someone walking behind me in the woods. But there was nothing, just the winding road, the trees, and the empty miles stretching ahead. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway, where I finally felt some relief. The city seemed so far away, but the sense of safety that came with it was undeniable. As I drove home, I kept replaying the events in my mind, wondering if I had imagined it all. But the footprints, the noise, the strange feeling of being watched, it was real. I never went back to that cabin, but I've often wondered, especially on quiet nights when I'm alone, if someone was truly out there, waiting for me, or if it was something else entirely, something that the woods had claimed long before I ever arrived.